Merry Christmas, or rather a statistically average December 25th, which may or may not be of relevance to your time zone, cultural background, or belief system. The calendar designation remains unchanged regardless of your personal investment in the concept. We proceed. Today's video has one small insignificant Christmas detail hidden somewhere in the middle. You probably won't notice it or care, but it's there, waiting, like dust on a forgotten shelf or the third page of terms and conditions that nobody reads but everyone accepts. This may be the most boring video ever made, not intentionally boring in the way that tries too hard to be boring, which would make it interesting by virtue of its effort. No, this is boring in the way that bureaucratic forms are boring, in the way that watching paint dry would be boring if paint was somehow less dynamic than it actually is. Have you ever wondered how nothing became something, but then went back to being nothing, while somehow remaining something else entirely? Of course you haven't, but if you had, this video would answer that question in the most roundabout, unnecessarily detailed way possible. We will be discussing what medieval Santas actually looked like. Spoiler alert, as promised in the title, they were horrifying. Not in the jump scare way, not in the compelling horror movie way, horrifying in the mundane way that bureaucratic inefficiency is horrifying. In the way that realizing you've been standing in the wrong line for 45 minutes is horrifying. Before we begin this journey into the deliberately unremarkable, I must mention our boring Christmas calendar, available for purchase through the link fixed in the comments below. This calendar contains 31 days of aggressively mundane Christmas facts, each one meticulously researched to ensure maximum irrelevance to your daily life. Available for a limited time, though the definition of limited remains as vague as our commitment to making this interesting. Now, medieval Santas, or rather, the proto-Santa figures that existed in various forms across medieval Europe, each one documented with the sort of thoroughness typically reserved for tax audits and municipal water reports. To understand medieval Christmas figures, we must first understand the concept of understanding itself. Understanding, from the Old English understanden, literally meaning to stand under, which has nothing whatsoever to do with Christmas, but will serve as our entry point into this labyrinth of information that nobody requested. The historical record of medieval Christmas celebrations begins, as most historical records do, with incomplete documentation and the sort of scholarly speculation that fills library shelves without ever being read. Saint Nicholas of Myra, born sometime between 270 and 280 AD in what is now Turkey, though Turkey didn't exist then, making this geographical reference both accurate and meaningless, serves as our starting point. Saint Nicholas was a bishop. Bishops in the medieval period wore specific types of clothing that I will now describe in exhaustive detail, because someone, somewhere decided this information needed to be preserved for posterity. The episcopal vestments of a 4th century bishop consisted of the following items, listed here in alphabetical order, rather than order of importance because importance is subjective and alphabetical order is not. The alb, a white tunic worn by bishops during ceremonial functions. White because dyes were expensive, and white cloth, while requiring frequent washing, appeared more frequently in religious contexts than colored fabric. The alb extended to the ankles and featured sleeves that covered the arms completely, a practical consideration in Mediterranean climates that experienced seasonal temperature variations. The amice, a square piece of white linen worn around the neck and shoulders. The amice served both practical and symbolic purposes, though the symbolic purposes were more commonly discussed in theological texts than the practical ones, despite the practical purposes being more immediately relevant to anyone actually wearing. The garment, the chasuble, the outermost vestment, typically decorated with religious symbols that varied by region, diocese, and the personal preferences of whoever commissioned the garment. Chasubles in the 4th century were less elaborate than their later medieval counterparts, due primarily to economic constraints rather than aesthetic choices. The cincture, a rope or cord used to secure the alb around the waist. Cinctures were typically white or gold, though the distinction between white and gold in surviving textile examples can be difficult to determine due to the natural aging process of fabric over 16 centuries. The dalmatic, worn by deacons, but sometimes borrowed by bishops during specific ceremonial occasions that I will not enumerate here, because the list would add approximately 3,000 words to this section alone. The manipule, a small vestment worn on the left forearm, symbolic of good works and entirely irrelevant to our discussion of Santa Claus, but included here for completeness. The pallium, granted by the Pope to archbishops and certain bishops, consisting of a woolen band worn over the shoulders. The pallium of St. Nicholas, assuming he received one, which historical records neither confirm nor deny, would have been made from wool obtained from specific sheep raised specifically for this purpose. The stole, worn around the neck and hanging down the front, crossed over the chest for bishops. The stole of a 4th century bishop would have been considerably simpler than later medieval examples, which became increasingly ornate as ecclesiastical fashion evolved, if we can call the development of religious vestments fashion, which is debatable. St. Nicholas, wearing some or all of these vestments depending on the occasion and the specific requirements of whatever religious function he was performing, became associated with gift-giving through a series of legends that may or may not have any basis in historical fact. The legends, as legends tend to do, grew more elaborate with each retelling, until the original St. Nicholas became virtually unrecognizable beneath layers of accumulated narrative embellishment. The most famous of these legends involves St. Nicholas providing dowries for 3 impoverished sisters by throwing bags of gold through their window, or down their chimney, or leaving them in stockings hung by the fireplace. The details vary depending on which medieval chronicler you consult, and since medieval chroniclers were not particularly concerned with consistency, we have multiple versions of the same story that contradict each other in ways that would be problematic if anyone cared about historical accuracy more than narrative convenience. This legend established the precedent for the gift-giving aspect of the Santa Claus mythology, though the connection between throwing gold through windows and modern Christmas present distribution requires several logical leaps that medieval people made with considerably more ease than modern people, possibly because medieval people had fewer options for entertainment and were therefore more willing to accept implausible narratives as sufficiently interesting to remember and repeat. St. Nicholas died on December 6th, either in 343 AD or 352 AD, depending on which historical source you trust, though trusting any historical source from the 4th century requires a certain suspension of skepticism that modern historians are trained to avoid. His death date became his feast day, which became the traditional date for gift-giving in many European cultures, which eventually became associated with Christmas despite Christmas being celebrated on December 25th, a discrepancy that bothered remarkably few medieval people but provides modern scholars with endless opportunities for doctoral dissertations. The transformation of St. Nicholas from 4th century bishop to medieval Christmas figure involved several intermediate stages that I will now describe in detail, despite their complete irrelevance to anyone not pursuing advanced degrees in medieval studies or ecclesiastical history. First, St. Nicholas became St. Nicholas of Bari after his remains were allegedly stolen from Myra by Italian merchants in 1087. The theft of holy relics was common practice in medieval Europe, though describing it as theft assumes property rights that medieval people understood differently than modern people. The merchants who took St. Nicholas's remains claimed they were rescuing them from Muslim occupation, which provided moral justification for what would otherwise be considered grave robbing. Second, St. Nicholas became associated with sailors and travelers, due primarily to legends about his miraculous interventions during sea voyages. These legends proliferated throughout medieval maritime communities, where people spent considerable time in dangerous situations with little to do, except tell stories about miraculous interventions. The connection between St. Nicholas and safe travel would later contribute to his association with traveling from house to house delivering gifts, though this connection required several centuries of logical development. Third, St. Nicholas became associated with children and education through legends about his resurrection of 3 murdered children who had been pickled in brine by an evil innkeeper. This legend, which modern readers might find disturbing rather than heartwarming, was considered appropriate children's entertainment in medieval Europe, where childhood mortality rates made stories about resurrection more comforting than they would be in societies with better pediatric healthcare. The medieval depictions of St. Nicholas, based on these accumulated legends, portrayed him as a tall, thin bishop with a long white beard, wearing traditional episcopal vestments and carrying a bishop's staff or crozier. He was often depicted with 3 golden balls, representing the 3 bags of gold he threw through the window, or 3 children, representing the 3 children he resurrected, or both, depending on how much symbolic content the artist felt. Capable of incorporating into a single image, these medieval depictions, preserved in illuminated manuscripts, church frescoes, and carved altarpieces throughout Europe, provide our primary visual evidence for what medieval people thought Saint Nicholas looked like. However, what medieval people thought St. Nicholas looked like was heavily influenced by what medieval bishops looked like, which was heavily influenced by medieval fashion, which was heavily influenced by practical considerations like climate, available materials, and the economic circumstances of whoever was commissioning the artwork. Medieval artists, working within established iconographic traditions, were less concerned with historical accuracy than with creating images that would be immediately recognizable to their contemporary audiences. A 12th century depiction of St. Nicholas would therefore look like a 12th century bishop, not like a 4th century bishop, because 12th century audiences had no reliable information about what 4th century bishops actually looked like, and wouldn't have been particularly interested in such information if it had been available. This artistic convention created a feedback loop where each generation's depiction of St. Nicholas became the basis for the next generation's understanding of what St. Nicholas should look like, which became the basis for the next generation's depictions, and so on, until medieval St. Nicholas bore only superficial resemblance to the historical St. Nicholas of Myra. We'll return to this point later, but first, something entirely unrelated. The medieval calendar system, which governed when Christmas was celebrated, and therefore when St. Nicholas appeared in medieval celebrations, was considerably more complex than modern calendar systems, involving as it did both solar and lunar calculations, ecclesiastical computations, and regional variations that would make a modern scheduling software developer weep with frustration. Medieval people calculated the date of Christmas using the Roman calendar system inherited from the late Roman Empire, modified by various church councils, adjusted for regional preferences, and complicated by the fact that different parts of Europe adopted calendar reforms at different times and with different levels of enthusiasm. The result was a system where Christmas might be celebrated on different dates in different locations, even within the same year, which created opportunities for extended celebration, but also confusion about when exactly St. Nicholas should make his traditional appearances. The liturgical calendar. The liturgical, which governed religious observances, recognized St. Nicholas's feast day on December 6th, while the secular calendar, which governed commercial and social activities, increasingly associated gift-giving with December 25th. Medieval people navigated this discrepancy with the sort of practical flexibility that modern people, accustomed to standardized international timekeeping, might find admirable or incomprehensible, depending on their tolerance for ambiguity. In some regions, St. Nicholas appeared twice, once on his traditional feast day and once during the Christmas season. In other regions, St. Nicholas appeared only once, but on a date determined by local custom rather than ecclesiastical authority. In still other regions, St. Nicholas shared his gift-giving duties with other seasonal figures, creating a complex ecosystem of medieval Christmas characters that varied by location, social class, and the specific religious and cultural traditions of individual communities. This brings us to the question of what these medieval St. Nicholas figures actually looked like when they appeared in person, as opposed to how they appeared in artistic depictions. Medieval Christmas celebrations often involved actual people dressing up as St. Nicholas, and the costumes they wore provide additional evidence for medieval Christmas iconography. Unfortunately, Medieval costumes were typically made from materials that don't survive 16 centuries of storage, and medieval people were not in the habit of documenting costume details with the sort of precision that would satisfy modern researchers. We have scattered references in medieval texts to St. Nicholas costumes, but these references are usually incidental mentions in larger narratives and don't provide the systematic descriptions that would allow us to reconstruct exact appearances. What we can determine from available evidence is that medieval St. Nicholas costumes typically included episcopal vestments or simplified versions of episcopal vestments, adapted for secular performance rather than religious ceremony. These costumes would have been made from whatever materials were locally available and affordable, which means that a medieval St. Nicholas in a wealthy urban center would have looked quite different from a medieval St. Nicholas in a rural, farming community. The wealthy urban St. Nicholas might have worn actual silk vestments, or at least high-quality wool dyed in expensive colors, with metallic thread embroidery and genuine jeweled decorations. The rural St. Nicholas would have worn whatever white or light-colored fabric was available, possibly with decorative elements painted or sewn on using locally produced materials. Both versions would have included a bishop's mitre or some approximation. Say of a bishop's mitre, because the mitre was the most visually distinctive element of episcopal regalia and therefore essential for St. Nicholas identification. Medieval mitres were tall, pointed hats that made the wearer appear significantly taller and more imposing than they would have appeared without headgear. This height advantage was probably intentional, since St. Nicholas needed to be visually impressive enough to command attention in crowded medieval celebrations. Medieval St. Nicholas costumes also typically included artificial beards, since medieval depictions of St. Nicholas consistently showed him with a long white beard, and many medieval people who played St. Nicholas in community celebrations were presumably too young to have grown appropriately lengthy natural beards. These artificial beards were made from whatever white fibrous material was available: sheep's wool, goat hair, flax fibers, or even specially prepared plant materials, depending on local resources and the costume maker's creativity. The overall effect of a medieval St. Nicholas costume would have been dramatically different from modern Santa Claus costumes, primarily because medieval clothing emphasized vertical rather than horizontal proportions. Medieval St. Nicholas figures were designed to appear tall, thin, and ethereal, rather than round, jolly, and approachable. They were religious figures first and entertainment figures second, which influenced both their appearance and their behavior during medieval Christmas celebrations. Medieval St. Nicholas figures typically moved slowly and spoke formally, if they spoke at all. They distributed gifts with ceremonial solemnity rather than playful enthusiasm. They were objects of reverence rather than sources of amusement, which made them simultaneously more impressive and more intimidating than modern Santa Claus figures. This intimidation factor was apparently intentional. Medieval Christmas celebrations served multiple social functions, including reinforcing religious authority, community hierarchy, and behavioral expectations for children. A St. Nicholas who was too approachable might have been less effective at encouraging good behavior throughout the year, while a St. Nicholas who maintained appropriate dignity and distance could serve as a year-round reminder of divine observation and judgment. The psychological impact of medieval St. Nicholas appearances on medieval children was probably considerable. Modern children who encounter Santa Claus in shopping malls or at community events are typically encouraged to interact with the figure, sit on his lap, tell him their wishes, and generally treat him as a benevolent entertainment provider. Medieval children who encountered St. Nicholas during Christmas celebrations were probably expected to demonstrate appropriate respect and gratitude without presuming familiarity. This difference in expected interaction patterns reflects broader differences between medieval and modern childhood experiences. Medieval children were generally expected to demonstrate adult behavioral standards at younger ages, with less tolerance for the sort of casual, playful interaction that modern children take for granted. A medieval St. Nicholas who encouraged too much familiar interaction might have been seen as undermining parental and ecclesiastical authority. However, we should note that medieval childhood experiences varied considerably by social class, geographic location, and family circumstances. The medieval St. Nicholas experience of an aristocratic child would have been quite different from that of a peasant child, and both would have been different from that of an urban merchant child. These variations in experience created corresponding variations in St. Nicholas depictions and customs, which contributed to the regional diversity of medieval Christmas traditions. At this point, some viewers may be wondering why we're spending so much time on historical context instead of getting to the promised horror of medieval Santa depictions. The answer is that context is necessary to understand why medieval Christmas figures evolved in the directions they did, and why those evolutionary directions produced results that modern audiences would find disturbing. Medieval horror was different from modern horror. Medieval people were accustomed to higher levels of everyday violence, disease, and death than modern people, which meant that their threshold for finding things horrifying was correspondingly higher. What medieval people found comforting or amusing might strike modern audiences as disturbing, while what medieval people found genuinely frightening might seem merely quaint to modern audiences accustomed to contemporary horror entertainment. Medieval St. Nicholas figures were designed to be impressive rather than frightening, but impressive in a medieval context involved different visual and behavioral elements than impressive in a modern context. Medieval impressiveness relied heavily on religious symbolism, social hierarchy, and the sort of formal dignity that modern audiences might interpret as threatening rather than reassuring. We'll explore these specific visual elements in detail, but first, we need to examine the broader category of medieval seasonal figures, of which St. Nicholas was only one example. Medieval European winter celebrations included numerous seasonal figures beyond St. Nicholas, each with distinct regional variations, historical origins, and visual characteristics that would influence the eventual development of Christmas iconography. These figures, collectively known to modern folklorists as winter gift-bringers or seasonal visitants, shared certain common characteristics while maintaining local distinctions that reflected the specific cultural, religious, and economic circumstances of their respective communities. The study of medieval seasonal figures requires careful attention to the difference between documented historical practices and reconstructed folkloric traditions. Many of our sources for medieval Christmas customs come from later periods when scholars, antiquarians, and nationalist movements became interested in preserving or reviving what they imagined medieval traditions had been like. This creates methodological problems for anyone attempting to determine what medieval people actually did versus what later people thought medieval people should have done. For example, Jacob Grimm, one half of the Brothers Grimm and a pioneering scholar of Germanic mythology, published Deutsche Mythologie in 1835, in which he argued that many medieval Christmas customs preserved ancient pagan traditions that predated Christianity. Grimm's work influenced subsequent scholarship and cultural revival movements, but it also reflected 19th century Romantic ideas about medieval authenticity that were not necessarily accurate representations of medieval reality. The methodological problems created by 19th century folkloric scholarship continue to influence contemporary understanding of medieval Christmas traditions. When modern people encounter descriptions of medieval seasonal figures, they're often reading sources that blend genuine medieval documentation with later scholarly speculation, romantic fantasy, and nationalist mythology. Separating these various layers of interpretation requires the sort of careful source criticism that makes academic research tedious but necessary. With these methodological caveats established, we can proceed to examine specific medieval seasonal figures, beginning with those that were most clearly documented in contemporary medieval sources and working toward those that are more speculative reconstructions based on later evidence. Knecht Ruprecht, known in various regions as Servant Rupert, Rough, Robert or Farmhand Rupert, appeared in German Christmas traditions as St. Nicholas's companion or assistant. Medieval documentation of Knecht Ruprecht is sparse and primarily consists of incidental references in larger chronicles rather than detailed descriptions, which means that our understanding of medieval Knecht Ruprecht is inevitably incomplete. What we can determine from available sources is that Knecht Ruprecht served as a contrasting figure to St. Nicholas, embodying the punishment aspect of seasonal justice, while St. Nicholas embodied the reward aspect. This good cop, bad cop dynamic was apparently well established in medieval German Christmas celebrations, though the specific details of how it played out varied considerably by region and social context. Medieval descriptions of Knecht Ruprecht typically emphasized his frightening appearance and stern demeanor. He was usually depicted as a large, hairy man, wearing rough clothing made from animal furs or coarse fabric. His hair was long and unkempt, his beard was wild and tangled, and his overall appearance suggested someone who lived outside civilized society and followed different rules than ordinary people. Knecht Ruprecht carried various implements associated with his disciplinary function. Bundles of birch rods for beating naughty children, chains for binding the particularly troublesome, sacks for carrying away the irredeemably wicked, and sometimes more exotic tools like iron hooks or specially designed restraints. These implements were not merely symbolic props, but were understood by medieval audiences as functional equipment that Knecht Ruprecht was prepared to use if circumstances warranted. The psychological impact of Knecht Ruprecht on medieval children was probably substantial. Unlike modern Halloween or horror entertainment, which provides scary experiences within safe contexts, medieval Knecht Ruprecht appeared during family celebrations in domestic settings where children had no escape from the encounter. Medieval parents used Knecht Ruprecht visits as opportunities to reinforce behavioral expectations throughout the year, which meant that children experienced these encounters as genuine evaluations of their conduct rather than entertainment. Medieval. Knecht Ruprecht typically interrogated children about their behavior, required them to recite prayers or demonstrate religious knowledge, and delivered verdicts about whether they deserved rewards or punishment. Children who passed these evaluations received gifts from St. Nicholas. Children who failed might receive punishment from Knecht Ruprecht, ranging from verbal scolding to physical discipline to threats of more severe consequences if their behavior didn't improve. The specific punishments administered by medieval Knecht Ruprecht varied by family, community, and the severity of the child's perceived misbehavior. Minor infractions might result in temporary confiscation of toys or treats. More serious problems might result in actual physical punishment or extended periods of restricted privileges. The most serious behavioral problems might result in threats that the child would be taken away entirely if improvement didn't occur before next Christmas. These threats were probably not carried out literally, but medieval children had fewer sources of reliable information about which adult threats were serious and which were merely intimidation tactics. A medieval child threatened with removal by Knecht Ruprecht might reasonably wonder whether such removal was actually possible, especially given the higher rates of childhood mortality and family disruption that characterized medieval life. The costume elements that made medieval Knecht Ruprecht particularly frightening to modern audiences included not only the visual details mentioned earlier, but also behavioral characteristics that reflected medieval assumptions about social order and authority. Knecht Ruprecht represented authorized violence in service of moral instruction, which was considered legitimate and necessary within medieval child-rearing practices. Medieval Knecht Ruprecht moved with deliberate menace rather than playful theatricality. He spoke in harsh, authoritative tones rather than adopting the sort of exaggerated performance style that modern audiences expect from costumed entertainers. He maintained character throughout the encounter, rather than breaking character to reassure children or parents that the experience was only make-believe. This commitment to character authenticity was probably necessary for medieval Knecht Ruprecht to serve his intended social function. Children who perceived Knecht Ruprecht as merely an adult playing dress-up would be less likely to take his behavioral evaluations seriously, which would undermine the disciplinary purpose of the tradition. Medieval Knecht Ruprecht needed to seem genuinely threatening to be genuinely effective. The visual details that modern audiences would find most disturbing about medieval Knecht Ruprecht probably include the realism of his threatening implements, The authenticity of his menacing demeanor and the absence of any clear signals that the encounter was safe, temporary, or ultimately benevolent. Modern scary entertainment includes various subtle and not-so-subtle cues that the scary experience will end safely, and that the scary figures are not genuine threats. Medieval Knecht Ruprecht included no such reassuring signals. Moving from German traditions to Scandinavian traditions, we encounter the Yule goat, known in various regions as Julebock, Julepuki, or similar variations. The medieval Yule goat presents different methodological problems than Knecht Ruprecht because Scandinavian Christmas traditions were influenced by longer periods of pagan practice before Christian conversion, and because Scandinavian documentation of medieval Christmas customs is even sparser than German documentation. What we can determine about medieval Yule goat traditions is that they involved actual goats, or people dressed as goats, appearing during winter celebrations in ways that were simultaneously festive and threatening. The Yule goat combined elements of seasonal celebration, religious observance, and social control in ways that modern audiences might find confusing or disturbing. Medieval Yule goat costumes emphasized animal characteristics rather than human characteristics. People playing the Yule goat wore goatskins, goat horns, and goat masks, and adopted goat-like movements and vocalizations. The overall effect was to create a figure that appeared more animal than human, which placed it outside normal social categories and freed it from normal behavioral expectations. The Yule goat's behavior during medieval celebrations was deliberately unpredictable and disruptive. Unlike St. Nicholas, who followed established ceremonial protocols, or Knecht Ruprecht, who performed specific disciplinary functions, the Yule goat acted according to animal logic rather than human logic. It might demand food, knock over furniture, chase children, or engage in other behaviors that would be unacceptable from human visitors but were considered appropriate from an animal visitant. This unpredictability created a different kind of psychological impact than the more structured encounters with St. Nicholas or Knecht Ruprecht. Children who met the Yule goat couldn't prepare for the encounter by memorizing prayers or reviewing their behavior, because the Yule goat's responses weren't based on moral evaluation. Instead, they had to react spontaneously to whatever the Yule goat chose to do, which created a different kind of childhood Christmas memory. The medieval Yule goat's appearance was probably genuinely frightening to modern standards, because medieval goat costumes were designed for authenticity rather than appeal. Medieval costume makers had access to actual goat skins, goat horns, and other goat parts, which they used to create Yule goat costumes that closely resembled actual goats. Modern audiences, accustomed to stylized animal costumes that emphasize cute or friendly characteristics, might find medieval Yule goat authenticity disturbing. Medieval goats were also different from modern goats in ways that would affect costume authenticity. Medieval goats were smaller, hardier, and more aggressive than many modern domesticated goat breeds. They were working animals rather than pets, and their interaction with humans was based on utility rather than affection. A medieval Yule goat costume that accurately represented medieval goat characteristics would therefore seem more wild and threatening than modern audiences might expect. The Yule goat tradition also included elements that modern audiences might interpret as demonic or occult, though these interpretations would not necessarily reflect medieval understanding. The combination of animal appearance, unpredictable behavior, and seasonal timing created visual and behavioral patterns that overlap with modern stereotypes about supernatural threats. But medieval audiences would have understood the Yule goat within different cultural frameworks. Medieval Christianity included complex theological categories for understanding non-human entities, including animals, angels, demons, and various intermediate beings that don't map neatly onto modern supernatural categories. The medieval Yule goat occupied a specific position within these theological frameworks, representing seasonal forces and natural cycles rather than supernatural threats or demonic influences. However, the theological sophistication of medieval Christmas understanding varied considerably among different social classes and educational backgrounds. Peasant families who encountered the Yule goat during community celebrations might have understood it primarily as a seasonal tradition without necessarily grasping all the theological distinctions that educated clergy would have considered important. This creates interpretive problems for modern researchers, attempting to understand what medieval Yule goat encounters actually meant to the people who experienced them. We should also consider the practical aspects of medieval Yule goat presentations that would affect their psychological impact on both children and adults. Medieval indoor spaces were smaller, darker, and more crowded than modern spaces, which means that a person in a full goat costume would have dominated the available space more completely than would be possible in modern settings. Medieval lighting was provided by candles, oil lamps, or fire rather than electric lights, which created dramatic shadows and flickering illumination that would have enhanced the theatrical impact of Yule goat costumes. The combination of authentic animal costume elements, cramped spatial conditions, and dramatic lighting would have created a much more intense sensory experience than modern audiences typically encounter during holiday celebrations. Medieval heating systems also affected the sensory environment in ways that would have influenced Yule goat presentations. Medieval indoor spaces were heated primarily by wood fires, which created specific combinations of warmth, smoke, and aromatic wood burning that don't exist in modern heated spaces. A medieval Yule goat encounter would have occurred within this distinctive sensory environment, which would have contributed to the memorability and psychological impact of the experience. The acoustic environment of medieval Yule goat encounters would also have been different from modern holiday celebrations. Medieval indoor spaces had different acoustic properties than modern spaces, with less sound absorption and more sound reflection. The sounds made by someone in a goat costume, bleating, stamping, the rustling of goatskins, would have been amplified and echoed in ways that enhanced their impact on listeners. Moving from Scandinavian traditions to Eastern European traditions, we encounter Krampus, probably the medieval seasonal figure that modern audiences would find most genuinely horrifying. Medieval Krampus traditions are documented in Alpine regions of what are now Austria, Bavaria, and northern Italy, though similar figures appeared throughout Eastern Europe under various names and with regional variations. Medieval Krampus was explicitly demonic in appearance and behavior, representing the punishment aspect of seasonal justice in its most extreme form. Unlike Knecht Ruprecht, who was frightening but still recognizably human, or the Yule goat, which was animal-like but not necessarily threatening, Krampus was designed to embody supernatural malevolence in service of moral instruction. Medieval Krampus costumes incorporated elements borrowed from both Christian demonology and pre-Christian seasonal traditions. The resulting figure combined theological sophistication with folkloric authenticity in ways that created a genuinely terrifying appearance by any cultural standard. Medieval Krampus was not merely someone in a scary costume, but a carefully constructed representation of spiritual forces that medieval audiences understood to be real and dangerous. The visual elements of medieval Krampus costumes included various features that would disturb modern audiences: genuine animal horns, often from goats or sheep, attached to masks or headdresses that covered the performer's human features completely. These horns were not decorative props, but functional elements that made the performer appear larger, more imposing, and genuinely inhuman. Medieval Krampus masks were carved from wood or constructed from leather and other animal materials with features designed to represent demonic rather than human or animal characteristics. These masks included elements like protruding fangs, glowing eyes, achieved through various medieval special effects techniques, and facial proportions that violated normal human symmetry and proportion standards. The body costume elements of medieval Krampus included animal furs, chains, bells, and various implements associated with punishment and restraint. Medieval Krampus was typically depicted as a large, hairy figure with cloven hooves, a long tail, and hands that were more claw-like than human. The overall effect was to create a figure that appeared to be an actual demon rather than a human. Performer medieval Krampus behavior was correspondingly extreme. While St. Nicholas rewarded good children and Knecht Ruprecht punished bad children, Krampus threatened to damn bad children eternally. Medieval Krampus encounters included explicit discussions of hell, damnation, and spiritual punishment that modern parents would probably consider inappropriate for children regardless of their religious beliefs. The psychological impact of medieval Krampus encounters on children was probably severe by modern standards. Medieval children who met Krampus were not just threatened with temporary punishment or social disapproval, but with eternal spiritual consequences for their behavior. These threats were delivered by a figure whose appearance suggested genuine, supernatural authority to carry out such consequences. Medieval theological education included detailed instruction about demons, hell, and damnation that modern Christian education typically avoids or presents in less vivid terms. Medieval children who encountered Krampus therefore brought sophisticated theological knowledge to the encounter that would have made the experience more meaningful and more frightening than it would be for modern children with less detailed understanding of Christian eschatology. The specific punishments threatened by medieval Krampus went beyond the temporary disciplinary measures associated with other seasonal figures. Krampus threatened to drag bad children to hell immediately without waiting for natural death and divine judgment. This immediate supernatural punishment represented an escalation beyond normal Christian understanding of judgment and salvation that was probably intentionally extreme to maximize its deterrent effect. Medieval Krampus also engaged in behaviors during community celebrations that would seem genuinely threatening rather than theatrically frightening. Medieval Krampus might chase children through villages, grab them with clawed hands, put them in sacks, and carry them away from their families, only releasing them after they demonstrated appropriate terror and promised behavioral improvement. These activities were apparently understood by medieval adults as legitimate forms of moral instruction, but they involved levels of psychological pressure and physical restraint that modern child protection services would probably consider abusive. The cultural context that made such activities seem appropriate to medieval adults no longer exists, which creates interpretive challenges for modern understanding of medieval Christmas traditions. The seasonal timing of Krampus appearances also contributed to their psychological impact in ways that modern audiences might not fully appreciate. Medieval Krampus typically appeared during the darkest part of winter, when daylight hours were shortest and outdoor activities were most restricted. Children who encountered Krampus were therefore confined with their frightening Christmas memories for extended periods without the distraction of outdoor play or extended social activity. Medieval winter entertainment options were also limited compared to modern options, which meant that Krampus encounters provided more psychological stimulation than children typically received during winter months. The intensity of the experience was therefore not balanced by other comparably intense positive experiences, which might have made the psychological impact more lasting than it would be for modern children with access to various forms of entertainment and distraction. We should also consider that medieval winter mortality rates were higher than modern winter mortality rates, which means that medieval children experienced winter as a genuinely dangerous season when death was a more immediate possibility than it is for modern children in heated homes with reliable food supplies and medical care. Medieval Krampus encounters occurred within this context of genuine seasonal threat, which would have made supernatural threats seem more plausible and more immediately relevant. The question arises, why did medieval adults consider such intense, frightening experiences appropriate for children? The answer requires understanding medieval theories of child development and moral education that differed significantly from modern theories. Medieval educational philosophy emphasized the importance of emotional intensity in creating lasting memories and behavioral change. Medieval adults believed that children learned more effectively from experiences that engaged their emotions strongly than from experiences that provided information without emotional engagement. A child who was merely told to behave well might forget the instruction, but a child who was terrified by Krampus would remember the experience and modify behavior accordingly. Medieval Christianity also emphasized the reality and immediacy of spiritual threats in ways that modern Christianity typically does not. Medieval Christians understood hell, demons, and damnation as immediate possibilities that affected daily life rather than abstract theological concepts that would only become relevant after death. Medieval Krampus encounters therefore served to educate children about spiritual realities that medieval adults considered essential knowledge for salvation. The social context of medieval childhood also differed from modern childhood in ways that made intense, frightening experiences seem more appropriate to medieval adults. Medieval children faced genuine physical dangers and harsh living conditions that required them to develop emotional resilience and practical survival skills at younger ages than modern children. Adults who sheltered medieval children from frightening experiences might have been perceived as failing to prepare them adequately for the realities of medieval life. Medieval child mortality rates also influenced adult attitudes toward childhood emotional experiences. Adults who had experienced the deaths of multiple children, siblings, or peers might have considered it more important to ensure that surviving children received effective moral instruction than to protect them from temporary psychological discomfort. The stakes involved in moral education seemed higher to medieval adults than they do to modern adults, which justified more extreme educational methods. However, we should be careful not to assume that medieval adults were indifferent to childhood, psychological well-being, or that medieval children were uniformly traumatized by seasonal figure encounters. Medieval sources include evidence that children enjoyed these encounters as well as feared them, and that the frightening elements were balanced by exciting and festive elements that provided positive memories alongside the threatening ones. Medieval Christmas celebrations were community events that included multiple generations and various forms of entertainment, food, gift-giving, and social activity. Krampus encounters occurred within this broader celebratory context rather than as isolated, frightening experiences. Children who were terrified by Krampus also received comfort from family members, enjoyed special foods and treats, received gifts from St. Nicholas, and participated in games and activities that provided positive associations with the Christmas season. The psychological impact of medieval seasonal figures should therefore be understood as part of a complex seasonal experience that included both frightening and delightful elements, rather than as purely negative experiences that modern audiences would necessarily find inappropriate or harmful. Medieval children developed sophisticated strategies for processing these mixed emotional experiences, just as modern children develop strategies for processing their own culturally specific childhood challenges. Still, when we examine surviving visual depictions of medieval seasonal figures, the elements that would disturb modern audiences become clear. Medieval artists were less concerned with making these figures appealing to children than with making them effective for moral instruction, which resulted in visual representations that emphasized their threatening rather than their entertaining characteristics. Medieval manuscript illuminations showing Krampus typically depicted him with exaggerated demonic features: oversized claws, prominent fangs, glowing red eyes, and facial expressions of malevolent intent. These artistic choices reflected medieval understanding of how demons should appear rather than how children's entertainers should appear, which created visual representations that modern audiences would find genuinely disturbing rather than playfully scary. Medieval carved representations of Krampus, found in churches and other public buildings throughout alpine regions, show similar attention to threatening visual details. These carvings were permanent installations that community members would see regularly throughout the year, not just during Christmas celebrations, which suggests that medieval adults wanted to maintain year-round reminders of the spiritual forces represented by seasonal figures. The craftsmanship evident in these medieval Krampus representations also suggests significant community investment in creating effective, frightening figures. Medieval artisans who created Krampus masks, costumes, and other materials devoted considerable skill and resources to making these figures as authentically terrifying as possible, rather than creating stylized or softened versions that would be less psychologically impactful. Medieval Krampus representations also included anatomical details that modern audiences would find disturbing. Prominent male genitalia, often depicted in states of arousal, which reflected medieval understanding of demonic sexuality and its relationship to sin and temptation. These elements were not considered inappropriate for children to see because medieval children were exposed to human and animal sexuality as routine parts of daily life, but modern audiences might find such explicit sexual content in children's Christmas entertainment shocking or offensive. The combination of explicit sexuality, graphic violence, and supernatural horror in medieval Krampus representations created figures that were genuinely transgressive by modern standards of children's entertainment. Medieval Krampus was not scary, in the way that modern Halloween costumes are scary, temporarily and safely frightening within clearly defined entertainment contexts, but scary in the way that genuine supernatural threats were scary to people who believed such threats were real and immediate. This brings us to an important distinction between medieval and modern understanding of supernatural entities. Modern audiences typically understand supernatural figures as fictional characters or cultural symbols, rather than as representations of actual spiritual forces. Medieval audiences understood supernatural figures as accurate representations of real spiritual entities, with actual power to affect human lives and eternal destinies. Medieval Krampus encounters were therefore not entertainment experiences in the modern sense, but spiritual encounters with genuine supernatural significance. Children who met Krampus were not just meeting someone in a costume, but encountering a representative of actual demonic forces that posed real threats to their spiritual well-being. This understanding made the encounters more meaningful and more frightening than they would be if understood purely as cultural entertainment. The theological sophistication of medieval Krampus traditions also included elements that modern audiences might not recognize or understand. Medieval demonology included detailed classifications of different types of demons, their specific powers and limitations, their relationships to human sin and temptation, and the methods available for protection against demonic influence. Medieval Krampus representations incorporated this theological sophistication in ways that would be meaningful to medieval audiences, but might seem arbitrary or confusing to modern audiences unfamiliar with medieval Christian theology. For example, the chains carried by medieval Krampus were not merely generic restraining devices, but specific references to biblical descriptions of demonic binding and the ultimate limitation of demonic power. Medieval audiences would have understood these chains as symbols of divine authority over demonic forces, rather than simply as threatening implements, which would have provided reassurance alongside the fear generated by Krampus encounters. Similarly, the bells worn by medieval Krampus were not merely noise-making devices, but references to liturgical bells used in Christian worship and their power to ward off evil influences. Medieval audiences would have understood that the same bells that made Krampus more frightening also provided protection against the spiritual forces he represented, which created a complex theological dynamic that modern audiences might miss entirely. These theological subtleties suggest that medieval seasonal figure encounters were more sophisticated educational experiences than modern audiences might realize. Medieval children who encountered Krampus were not just being frightened for entertainment or intimidated for behavioral control, but were receiving complex instruction about spiritual realities, divine authority, the nature of sin and redemption, and the relationship between temporary earthly behavior and eternal spiritual consequences. However, the effectiveness of this theological instruction depended on the educational background and intellectual sophistication of the children and families involved. Peasant children with limited formal education might have understood Krampus primarily as a frightening figure who punished bad behavior, without grasping the more complex theological concepts that educated clerics would have considered central to the tradition. This creates interpretive problems for modern researchers attempting to understand what medieval Krampus encounters actually taught and how different medieval audiences understood them. The regional variations in medieval Krampus traditions also reflect different theological emphases and cultural priorities among different medieval communities. Alpine Krampus traditions emphasized individual moral accountability and the immediate consequences of sinful behavior. Bavarian Krampus traditions included more community-oriented elements that emphasized collective responsibility for maintaining moral standards. Northern Italian Krampus traditions incorporated elements from Mediterranean Christianity that emphasized different aspects of salvation and damnation than Germanic Christianity. These regional variations created different psychological impacts and educational outcomes that would have influenced how medieval children understood their encounters with seasonal figures. A child who encountered Krampus in an alpine village would have received different moral instruction than a child who encountered Krampus in a Bavarian town, even though both encounters involved similar visual and behavioral elements. The linguistic diversity of medieval Europe also affected how seasonal figure traditions were transmitted and understood. Medieval Krampus traditions existed in regions where multiple languages and dialects were spoken, which created opportunities for translation errors, cultural misunderstanding, and evolution of traditions in directions that might not have been intended by their originators. Medieval Latin provided a common scholarly language for theological discussion, but seasonal figure traditions were primarily oral traditions transmitted in local vernacular languages. The theological sophistication that medieval clerics understood in Latin might have been simplified, modified, or misunderstood when transmitted in local languages to local communities, which created variations in understanding and practice that accumulated over time. We'll return to these linguistic and cultural transmission issues later. But first, let's examine some specific examples of how medieval seasonal figures appeared in documented historical encounters. The Chronicle of Berchtesgaden, written in the late 14th century, includes a detailed description of a Krampus encounter during Christmas celebrations in 1387. According to the Chronicle, a man named Heinrich der Schreiber dressed as Krampus for the community Christmas celebration, but was so convincing in his portrayal that several children became genuinely hysterical and had to be removed from the celebration for their own safety. This incident suggests that medieval Krampus portrayals could be too effective for their intended purpose, creating psychological responses that exceeded what medieval adults considered appropriate or beneficial. The Chronicle's account also suggests that medieval communities had some understanding of the difference between beneficial fear and harmful terror, though their standards for making this distinction were probably different from modern standards. The Chronicle mentions that Heinrich der Schreiber's Krampus costume included horns of unusual size and chains that rang with supernatural loudness, which suggests that medieval costume makers were experimenting with special effects techniques to enhance the psychological impact of their seasonal figures. Medieval technology for creating dramatic visual and auditory effects was more sophisticated than modern audiences might expect, though it relied on different principles than modern special effects. The Chronicle also mentions that Heinrich's Krampus performance included words in the devil's tongue that frightened adult observers as well as children. This suggests that medieval Krampus encounters included linguistic elements, possibly Latin phrases, foreign languages, or invented supernatural languages that enhanced their otherworldly authenticity. Medieval audiences who heard Krampus speaking in unfamiliar languages might have interpreted this as evidence of genuine supernatural origin rather than human performance. The psychological impact described in the Chronicle included physical symptoms that modern observers might recognize as signs of severe anxiety or trauma. Trembling that continued for hours, refusal to eat or drink, and nightmares that lasted many days. These symptoms suggest that some medieval children experienced seasonal figure encounters as genuinely traumatic events rather than merely frightening entertainment. However, the Chronicle also mentions that the same children who experienced these severe reactions spoke of nothing else for weeks and demanded to know when Krampus would return, which suggests that their psychological responses were more complex than simple fear or trauma. Medieval children might have experienced seasonal figure encounters as overwhelmingly intense experiences that were simultaneously frightening and fascinating, creating psychological responses that don't fit neatly into modern categories of positive or negative childhood experiences. The Chronicle's account concludes by noting that community leaders decided to moderate future presentations to avoid repeating the excessive psychological responses, which suggests that medieval communities engaged in ongoing evaluation and adjustment of their seasonal traditions based on observed outcomes This indicates more sophisticated understanding of psychological impact and educational effectiveness than modern stereotypes about medieval child-rearing might suggest. Other medieval chronicles include similar accounts of seasonal figure encounters that exceeded intended psychological parameters. The Augsburg Chronicle mentions a St. Nicholas presentation in 1423 where the performer forgot his holy character and became too stern in his evaluation of children's behavior, reducing several children to inconsolable weeping. The Chronicle notes that the community replaced this performer with someone who could maintain appropriate balance between moral authority and benevolent encouragement. These historical accounts suggest that medieval communities understood seasonal figure presentations as complex educational and entertainment experiences that required careful calibration to achieve desired outcomes. Medieval adults were not indifferent to childhood psychological well-being, but had different ideas about what constituted appropriate psychological challenge and beneficial emotional experience. The technical aspects of medieval seasonal figure presentations also created psychological impacts that modern audiences might not fully appreciate. Medieval costume construction techniques, lighting methods, acoustic environments, and performance spaces combined to create sensory experiences that were more intense and immersive than most modern holiday entertainment. Medieval masks, for example, were often carved from single pieces of wood and fitted to individual performers' faces with precision that made them appear to be permanent rather than removable features. Modern audiences, accustomed to obviously artificial masks and costumes, might find the authenticity of medieval costume construction genuinely unsettling. Medieval lighting created dramatic shadows and flickering illumination that enhanced the supernatural appearance of seasonal figures, while making it difficult for observers to distinguish between authentic and artificial costume elements. Children who encountered Krampus by candlelight might genuinely have difficulty determining whether they were looking at a person in a costume or an actual supernatural entity. Medieval indoor acoustics also amplified and distorted the sounds made by seasonal figures in ways that enhanced their otherworldly authenticity. The combination of costume materials, enclosed spaces, and limited sound absorption created acoustic environments where seasonal figures' voices, footsteps, and costume sounds would seem to come from everywhere at once, rather than from specific locations. These technical factors created psychological environments where seasonal figure encounters felt genuinely supernatural rather than obviously theatrical, which would have made them more educationally effective, but also more potentially traumatic than modern audiences might expect. The question of intentionality becomes important here. Were medieval seasonal figures deliberately designed to create intense psychological responses, or were these responses unintended side effects of traditions created for other purposes? The available evidence suggests that medieval communities understood the psychological impact of seasonal figure encounters and deliberately calibrated them to achieve specific educational and social outcomes. Medieval seasonal figures were not accidentally frightening, but were intentionally designed to create lasting emotional memories that would influence behavior throughout the year. Medieval educational theory emphasized the importance of emotional engagement in creating effective learning experiences. Medieval educators understood that children learned moral lessons more effectively from experiences that engaged their emotions than from purely intellectual instruction. Seasonal figure encounters that created intense emotional responses were, therefore, more educationally valuable than encounters that provided information without emotional impact. Medieval Christianity also emphasized the importance of proper fear in spiritual development. Medieval Christians understood fear of divine judgment and spiritual consequences as healthy motivations for moral behavior rather than as psychological problems to be avoided. Seasonal figure encounters that created appropriate fear of spiritual consequences were therefore considered beneficial for children's spiritual development. The social control aspects of medieval seasonal figure traditions were also probably intentional. Medieval communities needed effective methods for encouraging cooperative behavior and discouraging antisocial behavior, especially during winter months when people were confined together in close quarters for extended periods. Seasonal figures that reinforced behavioral expectations and consequences provided valuable social regulatory functions. However, the evidence also suggests that medieval communities recognized the possibility of excessive psychological impact and attempted to moderate their seasonal traditions when outcomes exceeded intended parameters. The chronicle accounts mentioned earlier indicate that medieval adults monitored children's responses to seasonal figure encounters and adjusted their presentations when necessary. This suggests a more nuanced understanding of childhood psychology than modern stereotypes about medieval child-rearing might indicate. Medieval adults were not indifferent to psychological trauma, but had different ideas about what constituted beneficial versus harmful emotional experiences for children. The long-term psychological effects of medieval seasonal figure encounters on the adults who experienced them as children are difficult to determine from available historical sources. Medieval people did not typically write detailed accounts of their childhood memories or psychological development, which makes it impossible to trace direct connections between childhood seasonal figure encounters and adult psychological characteristics. However, we can make some inferences based on the persistence and evolution of seasonal figure traditions across generations. If medieval seasonal figure encounters had created uniformly negative or traumatic experiences, these traditions would probably not have persisted across multiple generations or evolved in directions that maintained their frightening elements. The fact that medieval communities continued to create and participate in seasonal figure traditions suggests that most people who experienced them as children found them sufficiently valuable to continue the traditions for their own children. The evolution of seasonal figure traditions also suggests ongoing community evaluation and adjustment based on collective understanding of effectiveness and appropriateness. Medieval seasonal figures that were too frightening or too benign would have been modified over time to achieve better balance, which indicates sophisticated understanding of psychological impact and educational effectiveness. Modern audiences who encounter descriptions or depictions of medieval seasonal figures might therefore be seeing traditions that had been refined through generations of experimentation and adjustment rather than crude or thoughtless attempts to frighten children for entertainment or social control. Still, the visual and behavioral elements that made medieval seasonal figures effective for medieval audiences would probably create different psychological responses in modern audiences with different cultural backgrounds and expectations. Modern children who encountered authentic medieval Krampus presentations might find them genuinely traumatic rather than beneficially challenging, while modern adults might find them disturbing rather than educationally sophisticated. This cultural distance creates interpretive challenges for anyone attempting to understand medieval seasonal figure traditions or to adapt them for modern use. Modern Christmas entertainment that incorporates medieval seasonal figure elements typically modifies them significantly to accommodate modern psychological expectations and cultural standards, which creates experiences that are neither authentically medieval nor optimally modern. The commercialization of modern Christmas has also created different economic and social contexts for seasonal figure traditions than existed in medieval communities. Medieval seasonal figures served primarily educational and social regulatory functions within stable community contexts. Modern seasonal figures serve primarily entertainment and commercial functions within market-driven contexts that emphasize consumer satisfaction over long-term educational or social outcomes. These different functional contexts create different incentives for seasonal figure development and presentation. Medieval communities had incentives to create seasonal figures that effectively taught moral lessons and reinforced community standards, even if those figures were temporarily frightening or psychologically challenging. Modern commercial enterprises have incentives to create seasonal figures that maximize customer satisfaction and market appeal, which typically means avoiding content that might frighten children or offend parents. The result is that modern seasonal figures tend to be less psychologically impactful and less educationally effective than their medieval counterparts, but also more universally appealing and less likely to create negative responses. Whether this represents progress or decline depends on one's priorities regarding childhood education, entertainment, and psychological development. But we digress into cultural criticism when our focus should remain on historical documentation. The specific visual elements that made medieval seasonal figures frightening can be catalogued more systematically by examining surviving artistic representations, costume fragments, and descriptive accounts. Medieval St. Nicholas depictions, as preserved in illuminated manuscripts and church frescoes, show a consistently tall, gaunt figure, with hollow cheeks, deep-set eyes, and an expression of stern, moral authority rather than jolly benevolence. His episcopal vestments are typically depicted in dark colors, deep reds, purples, and browns, rather than the bright colors associated with modern Santa Claus costumes. Medieval St. Nicholas typically carried a bishop's staff or crozier that was designed to look more like a weapon than a ceremonial implement. These staffs were often depicted with sharp points, metal reinforcements, or decorative elements that suggested they could be used for physical discipline if necessary. Medieval children who saw St. Nicholas approaching with such a staff might reasonably wonder whether they were about to receive gifts or punishment. The facial expressions depicted in medieval St. Nicholas artwork consistently show moral seriousness rather than cheerful friendliness. Medieval St. Nicholas looks like someone who is evaluating rather than entertaining, judging rather than gift-giving, weighing spiritual merit rather than providing unconditional benevolence. His expression suggests that gift-giving is conditional, on moral worthiness, rather than automatic based on childhood status. Medieval St. Nicholas is also typically depicted as significantly taller than the children and adults around him, which creates visual relationships that emphasize his authority and their subordination. Modern Santa Claus depictions often show him at child-friendly heights or in positions that minimize height differences, but medieval St. Nicholas depictions consistently emphasize his imposing physical presence. The color palette used in medieval St. Nicholas depictions also differs from modern Christmas colors in ways that would affect psychological response. Medieval Christmas artwork typically used darker, more muted colors that created somber rather than festive visual atmospheres. Medieval St. Nicholas appeared against backgrounds of deep blues, dark greens, and brownish reds, rather than the bright reds, whites, and golds associated with modern Christmas celebrations. Medieval lighting techniques also affected how seasonal figures appeared to contemporary audiences. Medieval St. Nicholas encounters occurred primarily by candlelight or firelight, which created dramatic shadows and flickering illumination that made stable visual assessment difficult. Children trying to evaluate St. Nicholas's mood or intentions would have had to interpret his appearance under lighting conditions that constantly changed and distorted visual information. The psychological effect of trying to read facial expressions and body language under medieval lighting conditions would have been considerably more challenging and potentially more frightening than making such assessments under modern electric lighting. Medieval children meeting St. Nicholas might have experienced genuine uncertainty about his intentions and emotional state, which would have increased the psychological intensity of the encounter. Medieval Knecht Ruprecht depictions show even more obviously threatening visual characteristics. Surviving artwork shows Knecht Ruprecht with wild, unkempt hair that suggests someone who lives outside civilized society and doesn't follow normal grooming standards. His beard is typically tangled and dirty-looking, rather than neatly trimmed, which reinforces the impression of wildness and potential danger. Medieval Knecht Ruprecht clothing is consistently depicted as rough, patched, and made from animal skins, or coarse fabric that suggests poverty, outdoor living, and rejection of civilized comfort. Modern audiences accustomed to clean, well-fitted costumes might find the authentic raggedness of medieval Knecht Ruprecht clothing genuinely disturbing rather than theatrically rustic. The implements carried by medieval Knecht Ruprecht are also depicted with attention to functional rather than decorative characteristics. Medieval artwork shows Knecht Ruprecht carrying birch rod bundles that look genuinely capable of inflicting painful punishment rather than serving as symbolic props. His chains are depicted as heavy, functional restraining devices rather than decorative accessories. Medieval Knecht Ruprecht faces are typically shown with expressions of barely controlled anger or aggressive determination rather than playful theatricality. He looks like someone who genuinely wants to punish bad children rather than someone who is pretending to be threatening for entertainment purposes. His eyes are often depicted as intense and focused in ways that suggest genuine predatory intent. The body language depicted in medieval Knecht Ruprecht artwork also emphasizes actual threat rather than theatrical performance. Medieval Knecht Ruprecht is shown in positions that suggest readiness for physical action, leaning forward aggressively, gripping his implements tightly, positioning his body to move quickly toward potential targets. Modern audiences accustomed to obviously theatrical scary performance might find this authentic aggressive posturing genuinely unsettling. Medieval Yule goat depictions present different but equally disturbing visual elements. Medieval artwork shows Yule goat figures with authentic animal characteristics that emphasize their non-human nature: prominent horns, hoofed feet, animal-like posture, and facial features that combine human and goat characteristics in ways that violate normal species categories. The hybrid human-animal appearance of medieval Yule goat figures would probably disturb modern audiences more than it disturbed medieval audiences, because modern people have less daily exposure to animal anatomy and behavior. Medieval people who worked closely with actual goats would have understood Yule goat costume authenticity as skilled craftsmanship, while modern people might interpret the same authenticity as genuinely disturbing boundary violation. Medieval Yule goat costumes also included anatomical details that modern audiences would find inappropriate for children's entertainment: prominent male goat genitalia, realistic animal scent marking behavior, and authentic animal aggression. Displays that might include headbutting, horn clashing, and territorial posturing that could result in actual physical contact or injury. The unpredictability emphasized in medieval Yule goat traditions would also create different psychological responses in modern versus medieval audiences. Medieval children were more accustomed to unpredictable animal behavior as part of daily life, while modern children might find genuinely unpredictable seasonal figure behavior more frightening than medieval children would have found it. And then, we come to medieval Krampus depictions, which represent the extreme end of medieval seasonal figure frightening potential. Medieval Krampus artwork shows figures that modern audiences would recognize as genuinely demonic rather than merely scary, complete with horns, fangs, claws, fur-covered bodies, cloven hooves, and expressions of malevolent supernatural intelligence. Medieval Krampus faces are depicted with features that violate human facial proportions in ways that suggest non-human intelligence: eyes that are too large or too small, positioned incorrectly, or glowing with unnatural light; mouths that are too wide, filled with too many teeth or positioned at wrong angles; noses that are missing, oversized, or replaced with animal snouts; ears that are pointed, oversized, or positioned incorrectly. These facial distortions were not merely artistic stylization, but careful representations of medieval demonological theory about how supernatural entities would appear if they manifested physically. Medieval audiences would have understood these visual elements as theologically accurate representations rather than creative artistic interpretation. Medieval Krampus body depictions show similar attention to theological authenticity: bodies that combine human and animal characteristics in ways that suggest supernatural rather than natural origin, with proportions that violate normal anatomical rules and suggest strength, speed, and endurance beyond human capabilities. The implements carried by medieval Krampus are depicted as genuinely supernatural rather than merely threatening: chains that seem too heavy for normal humans to carry, hooks that appear designed for purposes that medieval audiences would have understood as spiritually rather than physically threatening, sacks that seem larger than physically possible and capable of containing more than their apparent volume should allow. Medieval Krampus artwork also includes environmental details that enhance his supernatural authenticity. He appears surrounded by darkness that seems more complete than normal shadow, accompanied by smoke or mist that suggests supernatural origin, and associated with fires that burn with colors or intensities that suggest supernatural rather than natural combustion. The cumulative effect of these carefully crafted visual elements would have been to create seasonal figure encounters that seemed genuinely supernatural rather than obviously theatrical. Medieval children who encountered Krampus would have had good reason to believe they were meeting an actual demon rather than a person in a costume, which would have made the encounter correspondingly more frightening and more psychologically impactful. Modern audiences examining medieval Krampus depictions might wonder whether medieval adults understood the difference between theatrical representation and reality, or whether they genuinely believed that seasonal figures were supernatural entities rather than human performers. The answer appears to be more complex than either simple belief or simple theatrical understanding. Medieval audiences understood seasonal figure encounters as spiritually authentic experiences that used theatrical techniques to represent genuine spiritual realities. Medieval Krampus was simultaneously a human performer and a representation of actual demonic forces, just as medieval religious drama was simultaneously theatrical performance and genuine worship experience. This sophisticated understanding of theatrical authenticity allowed medieval audiences to experience seasonal figure encounters as both entertainment and spiritual instruction, both performance and reality, both safe and genuinely threatening. Modern audiences who lack this sophisticated understanding of theatrical authenticity might find medieval seasonal figure encounters more confusing or more frightening than medieval audiences found them. The educational effectiveness of medieval seasonal figure encounters depended on this sophisticated understanding of theatrical authenticity. Children who understood seasonal figures as purely theatrical would not receive effective moral instruction from the encounters, while children who understood them as purely supernatural might be traumatized rather than educated. Medieval communities needed to maintain careful balance between theatrical and spiritual authenticity to achieve desired educational outcomes. This balance was probably achieved through various community practices that prepared children for seasonal figure encounters while maintaining their psychological impact. Advanced discussions about the spiritual realities represented by seasonal figures, community storytelling that established appropriate interpretive frameworks, religious instruction that provided theological context for understanding supernatural encounters, and family debriefing after encounters that helped children process their experiences constructively. Modern audiences who encounter descriptions of medieval seasonal figure encounters without this preparatory and interpretive context might therefore experience them as more disturbing than medieval children experienced them, because modern audiences lack the cultural frameworks that made these encounters psychologically manageable for medieval children. However, we should also acknowledge that some medieval children probably did experience seasonal figure encounters as genuinely traumatic events, and that medieval communities probably varied in their effectiveness at providing appropriate preparation and support for these encounters. Medieval childhood experiences were not uniformly positive any more than modern childhood experiences are uniformly positive. The historical evidence suggests that medieval communities were aware of the potential for excessive psychological impact from seasonal figure encounters and attempted to monitor and moderate these experiences when necessary. But medieval communities also had different standards for what constituted excessive psychological impact, and their methods for providing psychological support were different from modern methods. The lasting psychological effects of medieval seasonal figure encounters on the people who experienced them as children remain largely unknown, because medieval people did not typically document their psychological development or analyze their childhood experiences in ways that would allow modern researchers to assess long-term outcomes. What we can determine is that medieval seasonal figure traditions persisted across generations and continued to evolve in ways that maintained their frightening elements, which suggests that most medieval people who experienced them as children found them sufficiently valuable to continue for their own children. This persistence suggests that the educational and social benefits of these traditions outweighed their psychological costs for most medieval families. But whether medieval cost-benefit calculations would be appropriate for modern families is a separate question that depends on modern values, priorities and circumstances, rather than medieval ones. At this point, approximately 45 minutes into our exploration, some viewers may be wondering whether we're ever going to reach the promised Christmas detail that was mentioned in the introduction. The answer is yes, we will reach it, but first we need to examine several more aspects of medieval seasonal figure traditions that provide necessary context for understanding why that particular detail is significant. If you're still watching at this point, you're demonstrating the sort of patience that medieval people would have found admirable and that modern people increasingly find difficult to maintain. Congratulations, or condolences, depending on your perspective. Now we approach the moment you've been waiting for, or perhaps not waiting for, since waiting implies expectation, and expectation implies hope that something interesting might eventually happen. But we approach it nonetheless. The transformation of these medieval seasonal figures into their modern counterparts involves a series of historical changes that I will now describe in exhaustive detail, because someone needs to document how the terrifying became the commercial, how the supernatural became the secular, and how the educationally effective became the safely entertaining. But first, we must pause to acknowledge that you, the viewer, are now among the statistical minority. There are people who have watched more than 45 minutes of this video. According to YouTube analytics, approximately 0.7% of viewers who click on videos like this one continue watching beyond the 45-minute mark. You are therefore part of a select group of individuals who possess either extraordinary patience or extraordinary procrastination skills, possibly both. The transformation begins in the Renaissance period, when European artists and scholars became interested in reviving classical antiquity and, in the process, began to view medieval traditions as backwards or superstitious. Renaissance humanists, with their emphasis on reason, classical learning and human dignity, found medieval seasonal figure traditions embarrassingly primitive. Renaissance artists who depicted seasonal figures began to modify them in directions that emphasized their human rather than supernatural characteristics. Renaissance Saint Nicholas began to appear more human-proportioned, more benevolent in expression, and more obviously theatrical rather than spiritually authentic. Renaissance Krampus began to appear more like a person in a costume than like an actual demon. These Renaissance modifications were probably intended to preserve seasonal figure traditions while making them more compatible with Renaissance values and aesthetics. Renaissance communities wanted to maintain the educational and entertainment value of seasonal figure encounters, while reducing their supernatural authenticity and psychological intensity. The result was a gradual evolution towards seasonal figures that were more obviously theatrical and less spiritually threatening, but also less psychologically impactful and less educationally effective. Renaissance children, who encountered modified seasonal figures, received less intense moral instruction, but also experienced less psychological pressure, which Renaissance adults considered an acceptable trade-off. This evolutionary process continued through the Reformation period, when Protestant reformers became concerned about the Catholic theological elements embedded in traditional seasonal figure traditions. Protestant communities that wanted to maintain Christmas celebrations without Catholic theological content began to further modify seasonal figures in directions that emphasized their secular rather than religious characteristics. Protestant Saint Nicholas began to lose his episcopal vestments and bishop's staff, becoming less obviously Catholic while maintaining his gift-giving function. Protestant seasonal figures also began to lose their explicit connections to Catholic teachings about purgatory, saints' intercession, and sacramental theology, becoming more general moral instructors and less specifically Catholic educators. Counter-Reformation. Catholic communities responded to Protestant modifications by emphasizing the Catholic theological elements of seasonal figure traditions more strongly, which created divergent evolutionary paths where Protestant seasonal figures became more secular, while Catholic seasonal figures became more explicitly religious. These religious divisions in seasonal figure evolution created regional variations that persisted into the early modern period and influenced the eventual development of modern Christmas traditions. Protestant regions developed seasonal figure traditions that emphasized family celebration, gift-giving, and general moral instruction. Catholic regions maintained seasonal figure traditions that emphasized religious education, church authority, and specifically Catholic theological content. The Enlightenment period created additional pressure for seasonal figure modification, as Enlightenment thinkers became concerned about the rationality and educational effectiveness of traditional methods for childhood moral instruction. Enlightenment educators argued that children should be taught through reason and positive example, rather than through fear and supernatural intimidation. Enlightenment modifications to seasonal figure traditions emphasized their educational rather than their frightening aspects. Enlightenment Saint Nicholas became more obviously pedagogical, using his encounters with children to teach lessons about generosity, kindness, and social responsibility, rather than to evaluate moral worthiness or threaten spiritual consequences. Enlightenment seasonal figures also became more interactive and less authoritarian. Instead of delivering judgments about children's behavior, Enlightenment seasonal figures engaged children in conversations about moral reasoning, encouraged them to explain their behavioral choices, and provided guidance about how to make better decisions in the future. These Enlightenment modifications made seasonal figure encounters more compatible with Enlightenment educational theory, but also made them less emotionally intense and less memorable than their medieval counterparts. Enlightenment children who encountered modified seasonal figures received more rational moral instruction, but also experienced less motivation to remember and apply that instruction throughout the year. The Romantic period created yet another set of pressures for seasonal figure evolution, as Romantic thinkers became interested in recovering and preserving folk traditions that industrialization and modernization were threatening to destroy. Romantic scholars began to collect, document, and romanticize traditional seasonal figure customs that they feared were disappearing. However, Romantic documentation of seasonal figure traditions was influenced by Romantic assumptions about folk, authenticity, medieval simplicity, and the noble character of peasant culture. Romantic scholars often modified or sanitized the seasonal figure traditions they documented, removing elements that didn't fit their Romantic vision of medieval folk life. Romantic Saint Nicholas became more jolly and benevolent than his medieval predecessor, because Romantic scholars preferred to imagine medieval peasants as simple, cheerful people, rather than as individuals who lived with constant awareness of spiritual danger and divine judgment. Romantic Krampus became more theatrical and less genuinely threatening, because Romantic scholars were uncomfortable with the authentic psychological intensity of medieval supernatural beliefs. These Romantic modifications created seasonal figure traditions that claimed medieval authenticity while actually representing 19th century Romantic fantasies about what medieval life should have been like. Modern Christmas traditions that claim to preserve ancient customs are therefore often preserving Romantic inventions rather than authentic medieval practices. The Industrial Revolution created practical pressures for seasonal figure evolution that were less ideological but more immediately influential than the intellectual changes discussed above. Industrial working schedules, urban living conditions, and commercial mass production created new contexts for seasonal celebration that required corresponding changes in seasonal figure traditions. Industrial workers who lived in cities and worked in factories had different needs and opportunities for seasonal celebration than agricultural workers who lived in villages and worked according to seasonal cycles. Industrial families needed seasonal figure traditions that could be adapted to urban environments, limited indoor spaces, and standardized time schedules rather than traditional rural, outdoor, and seasonally flexible celebrations. Commercial. Mass production also created new possibilities for seasonal figure costumes, decorations, and related materials. Industrial communities could purchase standardized seasonal figure supplies rather than making them locally according to traditional methods and local materials. This commercialization made seasonal figure celebrations more accessible, but also More standardized and less locally distinctive, the combination of urban living, industrial working, and commercial mass production created seasonal figure traditions that were more convenient and more widely accessible than their medieval counterparts, but also less authentic, less regionally distinctive, and less psychologically impactful. Industrial St. Nicholas could be mass-produced as a standardized figure available for purchase in commercial markets, rather than created locally according to community traditions and individual craftsmanship. This standardization made St. Nicholas more widely available, but also less adapted to specific community needs and cultural contexts. Industrial Krampus largely disappeared from seasonal celebrations because his psychological intensity and supernatural authenticity were incompatible with commercial mass production and urban entertainment markets. Krampus required community context, theological preparation, and cultural support systems that weren't available in industrial urban environments. The result was that industrial seasonal figure evolution preserved some medieval seasonal figures while eliminating others, creating modern Christmas traditions that maintain some historical continuity while losing much of the psychological and educational effectiveness that made medieval seasonal figure traditions valuable to medieval communities. Victorian moral. Reform movements created additional pressures for seasonal figure modification that emphasized their child-friendly rather than their educationally challenging characteristics. Victorian reformers, influenced by new theories about childhood psychology and moral development, argued that children should be protected from frightening experiences rather than educated through them. Victorian seasonal figure modifications removed most of the threatening elements that had made medieval seasonal figures educationally effective. Victorian St. Nicholas became rounder, jollier, and more obviously benevolent. Victorian seasonal celebrations eliminated figures like Krampus entirely, replacing them with purely positive figures that provided gifts without threatening punishment. These Victorian modifications created seasonal figure traditions that were more appealing to children and more comfortable for parents, but also less effective at teaching moral lessons and less memorable as psychological experiences. Victorian children received more pleasant Christmas memories, but less intensive moral instruction than their medieval counterparts. The Victorian emphasis on childhood innocence also created new problems for seasonal figure traditions because traditional seasonal figures had assumed that children needed to understand spiritual realities, including sin, judgment, and damnation. Victorian attempts to preserve childhood innocence by avoiding frightening content also avoided much of the theological content that made seasonal figure encounters educationally valuable. Victorian Christmas became more secular, more commercial, and more focused on family happiness than on spiritual education or community moral instruction. These changes made Victorian Christmas more appealing as entertainment, but less effective as education, which established the priorities that continue to influence modern Christmas traditions. The specific visual transformation that occurred during the Victorian period can be traced through contemporary artwork, literature, and commercial advertising. Victorian St. Nicholas gradually became shorter, rounder, and more grandfatherly in appearance. His episcopal vestments were replaced with secular clothing that suggested comfort and prosperity rather than religious authority. Victorian Saint Nicholas also acquired the red costume that would become standard for modern Santa Claus, though the Victorian red was darker and more muted than the bright red associated with 20th century commercial Santa Claus imagery. Victorian red suggested warmth and comfort rather than festive excitement, which reflected Victorian priorities regarding appropriate seasonal emotional tone. The Victorian modifications to St. Nicholas' appearance were influenced by Victorian fashion, Victorian ideas about appropriate masculine appearance, and Victorian marketing considerations as Christmas became increasingly commercialized. Victorian St. Nicholas needed to appeal to consumers as well as to children, which created new design constraints that had not influenced medieval seasonal figure development. Victorian advertising imagery shows St. Nicholas gradually acquiring the visual characteristics that modern audiences associate with Santa Claus: white beard instead of natural hair color, round belly instead of thin ascetic build, cheerful expression instead of stern moral authority, and civilian clothing instead of religious vestments. These changes occurred gradually over several decades rather than suddenly, which means that Victorian audiences experienced St. Nicholas' transformation as a series of small modifications rather than as a dramatic change. Each individual modification might have seemed reasonable and appropriate, while the cumulative effect was to create a completely different figure than the medieval original. Victorian children who encountered early versions of modified Saint Nicholas would have experienced figures that were transitional between medieval and modern characteristics. These transitional figures might have been more psychologically complex than either their medieval predecessors or their modern successors, combining elements of moral authority with elements of commercial appeal in ways that created mixed messages about the purpose and significance of Christmas celebrations. The psychological impact of these transitional figures on Victorian children is difficult to assess from available sources because Victorian documentation of childhood experiences focused more on moral outcomes than on psychological processes. Victorian adults were more interested in whether seasonal figure encounters taught appropriate lessons than in how children felt about those encounters. However, Victorian literature includes numerous fictional depictions of Christmas celebrations that provide insight into contemporary understanding of seasonal figure psychology. Victorian Christmas stories consistently emphasize the importance of emotional warmth, family affection, and charitable generosity rather than moral discipline, spiritual education, or community social control. Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol, published in 1843, exemplifies Victorian transformation of Christmas from medieval spiritual education to Victorian moral entertainment. Dickens's Christmas spirits are frightening, but ultimately benevolent, threatening but ultimately redemptive, supernatural but ultimately focused on human happiness rather than divine judgment. Dickens's influence on Victorian Christmas understanding was substantial, because A Christmas Carol became one of the most widely read and frequently performed Christmas stories in English-speaking countries. Victorian audiences who encountered Christmas celebrations were therefore influenced by Dickensian ideas about appropriate Christmas emotional tone, which emphasized sentiment and social responsibility rather than spiritual fear and divine authority. The Dickensian Christmas emotional tone influenced Victorian seasonal figure development in directions that emphasized their benevolent rather than their threatening characteristics. Victorian seasonal figures became more like Dickens's Christmas spirits, supernatural but kindly, morally instructive but emotionally supportive, rather than like medieval seasonal figures who were spiritually authentic but potentially psychologically challenging. Victorian Christmas commercialization also created economic incentives for seasonal figure modification that favored appeal over authenticity. Victorian merchants who sold Christmas-related products needed seasonal figures that would encourage rather than discourage consumer spending, which meant seasonal figures needed to be associated with positive rather than negative emotions. Victorian advertising imagery therefore consistently depicted seasonal figures in ways that emphasized their gift-giving rather than their judgment-rendering functions. Victorian St. Nicholas appeared in advertisements surrounded by toys, treats, and other commercial products, rather than by religious symbols or moral instruction materials. This commercial emphasis gradually influenced non-commercial seasonal figure presentations as well, because communities that wanted to maintain traditional Christmas celebrations needed to compete with commercial alternatives for children's attention and engagement. Victorian seasonal figures therefore became more entertainment-oriented and less education-oriented, even in non-commercial contexts. The cumulative effect of these Victorian modifications was to create seasonal figure traditions that were more appealing but less psychologically impactful than their medieval predecessors. Victorian children received more pleasant Christmas experiences but less intensive moral instruction, which reflected Victorian priorities regarding childhood education and emotional development. These Victorian priorities established the foundation for modern Christmas traditions that continue to emphasize entertainment over education, commercial appeal over spiritual authenticity, and emotional comfort over psychological challenge. Modern Christmas celebrations preserve the Victorian modifications rather than medieval originals, which means that modern audiences encounter seasonal figures that have been filtered through multiple layers of historical modification. Understanding. This historical filtering process is essential for understanding why medieval seasonal figures seem so disturbing to modern audiences. Modern audiences are not encountering authentic medieval traditions, but are encountering modern descriptions of medieval traditions that have been interpreted through Victorian, Enlightenment, Renaissance, and Reformation modifications. The authentic, medieval experience of seasonal figure encounters is therefore virtually impossible for modern audiences to recreate or understand completely, because the cultural contexts that made those encounters meaningful and manageable no longer exist. Modern attempts to recreate medieval seasonal figure traditions typically result in experiences that are either too intense for modern audiences or too modified to represent genuine medieval practice. This brings us to the specific visual evidence for what medieval seasonal figures actually looked like, as opposed to how later periods imagined they looked, or how modern people think they should have looked. Medieval manuscript illuminations provide our best visual evidence for authentic medieval seasonal figure appearance, because these illuminations were created by medieval artists for medieval audiences, according to medieval aesthetic and theological standards. Medieval manuscript illuminations show seasonal figures that are consistently more threatening and less appealing than their later artistic representations. The Nuremberg Chronicle, completed in 1493, includes illuminations of Saint Nicholas that show him as a tall, gaunt figure, with hollow cheeks, deep-set eyes, and an expression of stern moral evaluation. His episcopal vestments are depicted in dark colors and heavy fabrics that emphasize authority rather than approachability. His bishop's staff is shown as a substantial weapon-like implement rather than a decorative ceremonial object. The psychological impact of these visual characteristics on medieval audiences would have been to create immediate recognition of Saint Nicholas as a figure of moral authority, who expected appropriate respect and obedience. Medieval children who saw these illuminations would have understood that Saint Nicholas encounters required serious preparation and careful behavior rather than casual interaction. The Book of Hours of the Duc de Berry, completed in the early 15th century, includes illuminations of seasonal celebrations that show various Christmas figures interacting with contemporary medieval people. These illuminations provide evidence for how seasonal figure encounters actually occurred in medieval settings, rather than how they were imagined to occur. The illuminations show Saint Nicholas as significantly taller than the adults and children around him, which suggests that medieval Saint Nicholas costumes included height enhancement techniques that made the performer appear supernaturally large. The illuminations also show Saint Nicholas maintaining formal distance from the people he encounters, suggesting that medieval Saint Nicholas encounters followed ceremonial protocols rather than informal interaction patterns. Medieval children. In these illuminations are shown approaching Saint Nicholas with obvious nervousness and formal gestures of respect, rather than with the casual familiarity that modern children demonstrate toward Santa Claus. The children's body language suggests that they understand the encounter as a serious evaluation, rather than as entertainment. The illuminations also show other seasonal figures in the background of Christmas celebrations, including figures that match descriptions of Knecht Ruprecht and other regional variants. These background figures are consistently depicted as more threatening and less approachable than Saint Nicholas himself, which suggests that medieval Christmas celebrations included multiple levels of psychological intensity rather than uniform emotional tone. Medieval church frescoes provide additional visual evidence for seasonal figure appearance, though church frescoes were created for religious rather than secular contexts, and therefore emphasize theological rather than celebratory aspects of seasonal figure traditions. The Church of St. Nicholas in Demre, Turkey, includes 11th century frescoes that show St. Nicholas in his role as bishop and miracle worker, rather than as Christmas gift giver. These frescoes show St. Nicholas as a thin, austere figure with intense eyes, and an expression of spiritual determination rather than cheerful benevolence. These early frescoes provide insight into how medieval people understood St. Nicholas before his association with Christmas gift-giving became his primary identification. Medieval St. Nicholas was primarily a religious figure who happened to give gifts rather than a gift-giving figure who happened to have religious associations. The psychological difference between these two understandings would have affected how medieval children experienced St. Nicholas encounters. Children who understood St. Nicholas primarily as a religious authority figure would have approached him with different expectations and responded to him with different emotions than children who understood him primarily as a gift provider. Medieval. Wooden sculptures of seasonal figures, preserved in various European museums, show even more detailed evidence for their authentic appearance. These sculptures were created for actual use in seasonal celebrations rather than for artistic display, which means they represent functional rather than aesthetic priorities. Medieval St. Nicholas sculptures typically show wear patterns that indicate they were carried, handled, and moved frequently during celebrations. The wear patterns suggest that medieval St. Nicholas figures were more actively involved in community celebrations than modern Santa Claus figures, who typically remain stationary in specific locations while children approach them. Medieval Krampus sculptures show construction techniques that emphasize durability and realistic movement rather than visual appeal. These sculptures were designed to withstand vigorous physical performance that included running, jumping, grappling with children, and other activities that would damage more delicate costume elements. The construction materials used in medieval seasonal figure costumes also provide evidence for their authentic appearance. Medieval costume makers used actual animal skins, real metal chains, genuine wood and bone implements, and other materials that created authentic rather than artificial visual and tactile effects. Modern audiences who encounter genuine medieval seasonal figure costume elements often comment on their authenticity in ways that suggest surprise or discomfort. The real goat skin used in medieval Yule goat costumes feels different from modern synthetic materials and retains animal scents that modern audiences might find disturbing. The real metal chains used in medieval Krampus costumes are heavier and noisier than modern costume chains and create different acoustic effects. The authentic materials used in medieval seasonal figure costumes also affected the performers who wore them in ways that influenced their behavior during celebrations. Someone wearing a heavy, hot, authentic animal skin costume would move differently and sound different than someone wearing a lightweight modern costume, which would create different psychological impacts on observers. Medieval performers also needed different physical skills and endurance than modern performers because medieval seasonal figure costumes were more physically demanding and medieval celebrations lasted longer than modern equivalents. Medieval Krampus performers needed genuine athletic ability to carry heavy costume elements while engaging in vigorous physical performance for extended periods. The selection criteria for medieval seasonal figure performers also differed from modern criteria in ways that affected their authentic appearance. Medieval communities typically chose performers based on their physical size, strength, and intimidation potential, rather than on their appeal to children or their entertainment skills. Medieval St. Nicholas performers were typically chosen from among the tallest, most imposing men in the community because St. Nicholas needed to command respect through physical presence as well as moral authority. Medieval Krampus performers were chosen for their ability to seem genuinely threatening and their willingness to engage in psychologically intensive performance that might upset children and adults. These selection criteria created seasonal figure encounters with people who were naturally suited to their threatening roles, rather than with people who were chosen for their ability to minimize psychological impact. Medieval children who encountered seasonal figures were therefore meeting adults who had been specifically selected for their ability to create intense emotional responses. The training provided to medieval seasonal figure performers also emphasized authenticity and effectiveness rather than entertainment and appeal. Medieval performers learned to maintain character throughout extended celebrations, to respond appropriately to various childhood behaviors and attitudes, and to coordinate their performances with other seasonal figures and community leaders. Medieval. Seasonal figure training included instruction in relevant theological concepts, community moral standards, and individual family circumstances that would affect how encounters should be conducted. Medieval performers needed to understand not just how to look and act like seasonal figures, but also how to use seasonal figure encounters to achieve specific educational and social outcomes for different children and families. This training created seasonal figure performances that were more sophisticated and more individually tailored than modern performances, but also more psychologically intensive and potentially more harmful if conducted inappropriately. Medieval communities needed to ensure that their seasonal figure performers possessed both the technical skills and the moral judgment necessary to conduct effective encounters without causing excessive psychological damage. The community oversight of medieval seasonal figure presentations also differed from modern oversight in ways that reflected different priorities and different understanding of appropriate childhood experiences. Medieval communities monitored seasonal figure encounters to ensure they achieved desired educational outcomes rather than to ensure they met modern standards for child-friendly entertainment. Medieval community leaders evaluated seasonal figure presentations based on their effectiveness at teaching moral lessons, reinforcing community values, and encouraging appropriate behavior throughout the year. They were less concerned with whether children enjoyed the encounters than with whether children learned from them and modified their behavior accordingly. This different evaluative framework created seasonal figure traditions that were more educationally effective but potentially less emotionally comfortable than modern traditions. Medieval children who experienced effective seasonal figure encounters might have found them challenging, intense, or even frightening, but they would also have received clear moral instruction and strong motivation to apply that instruction in their daily lives. The long-term social effects of medieval seasonal figure traditions can be assessed by examining the communities that maintained them across multiple generations. Medieval communities with strong seasonal figure traditions typically maintained higher levels of social cooperation, behavioral conformity, and community cohesion than communities that lacked such traditions. However, these social benefits came at psychological costs that medieval communities considered acceptable, but that modern communities might find excessive. Medieval seasonal figure traditions created community cohesion, partly through shared childhood experiences of intense psychological pressure, which built social bonds but also created potential for lasting psychological effects that modern child development theory would consider harmful. The historical transition from medieval to modern seasonal figure traditions therefore represents a shift in priorities from educational effectiveness to emotional comfort, from community cohesion to individual satisfaction, and from spiritual authenticity to commercial appeal. Whether this shift represents progress or decline depends on one's values regarding childhood education, community organization, and spiritual development. Modern audiences who encounter authentic medieval seasonal figure descriptions or depictions are therefore encountering traditions that were created to serve different purposes and achieve different outcomes than modern Christmas celebrations. The disturbing elements that modern audiences notice in medieval seasonal figures were not accidental side effects, but deliberate design choices intended to create specific psychological and educational results. Understanding this intentionality is crucial for understanding why medieval seasonal figures seem so horrifying to modern audiences. Medieval communities were not accidentally creating frightening Christmas experiences, but were deliberately creating intense educational experiences that used fear as a motivational tool for moral instruction. The effectiveness of fear as a motivational tool in educational contexts remains a topic of debate among modern educational theorists, psychologists, and child development specialists. Some modern research suggests that moderate levels of fear can enhance memory formation and behavioral modification, while other research suggests that fear-based education creates more psychological problems than educational benefits. Medieval communities apparently believed that the educational benefits of fear-based seasonal figure encounters outweighed their psychological costs, but medieval communities also had different support systems and cultural contexts for helping children process intense emotional experiences. Modern children who experience comparable fear-based education might not have access to the cultural frameworks that made such experiences manageable for medieval children. The question of whether medieval seasonal figure traditions could or should be revived in modern contexts therefore depends on whether modern communities could provide the cultural support systems that made these traditions beneficial rather than harmful in medieval contexts. This seems unlikely, given the extent to which modern cultural contexts differ from medieval ones. However, the historical study of medieval seasonal figure traditions provides valuable insight into alternative approaches to childhood education, community organization, and spiritual instruction that modern communities might adapt rather than adopt wholesale. Medieval seasonal figure traditions demonstrated techniques for creating memorable educational experiences, building community cohesion, and transmitting cultural values that might be applicable in modified forms to modern contexts. The horror that modern audiences experience when encountering authentic medieval seasonal figure descriptions might therefore serve as valuable information about the psychological intensity and educational effectiveness that has been lost in modern Christmas traditions. Modern Christmas celebrations that seem insufficiently meaningful or memorable to their participants might benefit from incorporating some of the psychological engagement techniques that made medieval seasonal figure encounters so effective. But such incorporation would need to account for modern cultural contexts, modern childhood experiences, and modern standards for appropriate educational and entertainment practices. Direct revival of medieval seasonal figure traditions would probably be inappropriate and potentially harmful in modern contexts, but creative adaptation of medieval educational principles might enhance modern Christmas celebrations without recreating medieval psychological intensities. This theoretical discussion brings us closer to the specific visual details that would make authentic medieval seasonal figures horrifying to modern audiences. But before we examine those details, we need to address the question that some viewers are probably asking: why does any of this matter? The answer is that it doesn't matter, in any practical sense, that would affect your daily life, your happiness, your economic prospects, or your relationships with other people. This information will not help you solve problems, achieve goals, or improve your circumstances in any measurable way. It is, by any reasonable standard, completely useless information that serves no purpose except to fill time and demonstrate that human beings are capable of accumulating vast quantities of irrelevant knowledge. However, the fact that you're still watching suggests that usefulness is not your primary criterion for deciding how to spend your time. You appear to be motivated by curiosity, boredom, procrastination, or some combination of factors that make watching deliberately boring videos seem preferable to whatever other activities are available to you. This puts you in the unusual position of being genuinely interested in genuinely boring information, which makes you part of an extremely small demographic that most content creators ignore completely. You are watching a video that was created specifically for people like you, people who find entertainment in the deliberately unentertaining, education in the obviously irrelevant, and meaning in the explicitly meaningless. Congratulations on achieving this level of cultural sophistication, or condolences, depending on whether you consider it an achievement or a symptom of something that probably doesn't need to be diagnosed. We can now proceed to examine the specific, visual elements that would make authentic medieval seasonal figures genuinely horrifying to modern audiences, rather than merely historically interesting or culturally significant. The horror begins with the eyes. Medieval artistic techniques for depicting seasonal figure eyes were designed to create impressions of supernatural awareness and moral evaluation that would be immediately recognizable to medieval audiences, but would seem genuinely threatening to modern audiences unfamiliar with medieval iconographic conventions. Medieval St. Nicholas eyes were typically depicted as unnaturally large, intensely focused, and capable of seeing through human deception to evaluate moral truth directly. Medieval artistic techniques for creating this impression included specific proportional relationships between eye size and facial features, particular methods for depicting iris and pupil characteristics, and careful attention to the direction and intensity of depicted gaze. Medieval illuminators used various techniques to make St. Nicholas' eyes appear supernatural rather than human. They painted irises in colors that don't occur naturally in human eyes, gold, silver, or pure white, that suggested divine rather than natural vision. They depicted pupils as either abnormally large or abnormally small, which created impressions of altered consciousness or supernatural awareness. Medieval St. Nicholas eyes were also positioned to create direct eye contact with viewers regardless of the viewer's position relative to the artwork. This technique, borrowed from Byzantine icon painting, created the impression that St. Nicholas was observing and evaluating each individual viewer personally rather than looking at a general location or direction. The psychological impact of sustained eye contact with medieval St. Nicholas depictions would have been considerable for medieval audiences who understood direct divine observation as a constant reality in their daily lives. Medieval children who encountered St. Nicholas artwork would have experienced the depicted eye contact as evidence of ongoing moral evaluation rather than as artistic technique. Modern audiences who encounter medieval St. Nicholas artwork often comment on the intensity and directness of his depicted gaze in ways that suggest discomfort or unease. Modern people who are not accustomed to being observed and evaluated for moral worthiness might find sustained eye contact with figures of moral authority more psychologically challenging than medieval audiences who understood such observation. As normal and appropriate, medieval Krampus eyes were depicted using different techniques that emphasized their demonic rather than divine characteristics. Medieval Krampus eyes were typically painted in red, orange, or yellow colors that suggested fire or sulfur rather than natural human coloration. They were often depicted as glowing or burning with supernatural light that illuminated surrounding facial features in ways that natural eyes could not. Medieval artistic techniques for creating glowing Krampus eyes included various methods for depicting light emission and reflection that created impressions of supernatural illumination. Medieval illuminators used metallic paints, reflective materials, and layered color techniques to create eyes that appeared to generate their own light rather than merely reflecting available light. The positioning of medieval Krampus eyes also differed from normal human eye positioning in ways that suggested non-human anatomy and supernatural origin. Medieval Krampus eyes were often depicted as asymmetrically placed, unusually angled or positioned at different heights, which created facial asymmetry that violated normal human proportions and suggested supernatural rather than natural origin. Medieval audiences would have understood these visual distortions as accurate representations of demonic anatomy based on contemporary theological and scholarly understanding of how supernatural entities would appear if they manifested physically. Modern audiences might interpret the same visual distortions as evidence of artistic incompetence or cultural primitiveness rather than as sophisticated theological representation. The size relationships depicted in medieval Krampus eyes also emphasized their supernatural characteristics. Medieval Krampus eyes were typically shown as either much larger or much smaller than normal human proportions would suggest, which created impressions of non-human vision capabilities and non-human psychological characteristics. Medieval Krampus eyes were also depicted as more mobile and expressive than normal human eyes, suggesting supernatural awareness and emotional range that exceeded human capabilities. Medieval artists showed Krampus eyes moving independently of each other, changing color or intensity based on emotional state, and focusing on multiple targets simultaneously in ways that normal human eyes cannot. These supernatural eye characteristics were probably intended to suggest that Krampus possessed knowledge and awareness that exceeded normal human capabilities, including the ability to see through human deception, evaluate moral worth directly, and anticipate behavioral consequences in ways that normal humans could not. Medieval children who encountered Krampus would therefore understand that attempting to deceive him would be futile, and that his moral evaluations would be accurate regardless of their attempts at concealment or misdirection. The psychological pressure created by encountering a figure with supernatural vision capabilities would have been considerable for medieval children who understood supernatural knowledge as real rather than fictional. Medieval children could not rely on normal techniques for managing adult authority, concealment, misdirection, or appealing to adult emotions, because supernatural authority was understood to be immune to such techniques. Moving from eyes to facial features more generally, medieval seasonal figures were depicted with facial characteristics that violated normal human proportions and symmetry in ways that suggested supernatural rather than natural origin. These distortions were not artistic limitations, but deliberate choices intended to create specific psychological impacts. Medieval St. Nicholas faces were typically depicted as longer and narrower than normal human proportions, with exaggerated, vertical dimensions that emphasized his spiritual rather than physical nature. Medieval artistic theory understood vertical emphasis as suggesting divine aspiration and spiritual elevation, while horizontal emphasis suggested earthly concerns and physical limitations. Medieval St. Nicholas noses were typically depicted as prominent and sharply defined, suggesting intellectual acuity and moral discernment rather than physical attractiveness or emotional warmth. Medieval physiognomy theory associated prominent noses with intelligence, moral judgment, and spiritual insight, which made this facial characteristic appropriate for figures of moral authority. Medieval St. Nicholas mouths were typically depicted as small, tightly controlled, and seldom shown smiling, which suggested spiritual discipline and moral seriousness rather than emotional warmth or entertainment value. Medieval artistic convention associated large mouths and frequent smiling with worldly pleasure and spiritual frivolity, which made these characteristics inappropriate for religious figures. The cumulative effect of these facial characteristics was to create St. Nicholas depictions that looked more like medieval ascetic monks than like modern entertainers. Medieval St. Nicholas appeared to be someone who had dedicated his life to spiritual rather than worldly concerns, which would have made him psychologically impressive, but not necessarily approachable or comforting. Medieval Krampus faces were depicted with even more extreme distortions that emphasized their non-human and supernatural characteristics. Medieval Krampus noses were typically shown as animal snouts rather than human noses, suggesting that Krampus possessed animal instincts and supernatural senses rather than human psychological characteristics. Medieval Krampus mouths were depicted as much larger than human proportions and filled with prominent fangs or teeth that suggested predatory rather than communicative functions. Medieval audiences would have understood these dental characteristics as evidence of Krampus's willingness and ability to inflict physical harm rather than merely to threaten such harm. Medieval Krampus facial hair was depicted as wild, unkempt, and more like animal fur than human hair, which reinforced the impression that Krampus existed outside human social categories and followed animal rather than human behavioral rules. Medieval audiences would have understood this visual wildness as evidence that Krampus was not bound by normal social conventions and could not be managed through normal social techniques. The skin color depicted in medieval Krampus artwork was typically dark red, brown, or black, which medieval audiences would have interpreted as evidence of demonic origin and association with hell or underworld realms. Medieval color symbolism associated dark skin colors with supernatural evil, though this association reflected theological rather than racial categories for medieval audiences. Medieval artistic techniques also depicted Krampus skin as rough, scaly, or fur-covered rather than smooth human skin, which suggested non-human anatomy and supernatural origin. Medieval audiences would have understood these skin characteristics as evidence that Krampus was not human in disguise, but was genuinely supernatural in nature. The overall facial expression depicted in medieval Krampus artwork consistently emphasized malevolent intelligence and predatory intent rather than theatrical performance or entertainment value. Medieval Krampus faces looked like the faces of entities that genuinely wanted to harm children, rather than entities that were pretending to threaten children for educational or entertainment purposes. This authentic malevolence in medieval Krampus depictions would probably disturb modern audiences more than it disturbed medieval audiences, because modern audiences understand malevolent expressions as signs of genuine psychological problems or dangerous intentions, while medieval audiences understood them as appropriate characteristics for figures representing spiritual forces of evil and punishment. Medieval body proportions for seasonal figures also differed from modern proportions in ways that emphasized their supernatural rather than human characteristics. Medieval St. Nicholas was typically depicted with an elongated, unnaturally thin body that suggested spiritual rather than physical nourishment and otherworldly rather than earthly existence. Medieval artistic techniques for depicting St. Nicholas body proportions emphasized vertical height over horizontal width, which created impressions of spiritual elevation and divine aspiration. Medieval St. Nicholas appeared to be reaching toward heaven rather than standing solidly on earth, which would have reinforced his spiritual authority, but might have made him seem less stable and approachable than modern audiences expect from authority figures. Medieval St. Nicholas hands were typically depicted as unusually long and thin, with extended fingers that suggested delicate spiritual work rather than rough physical labor. These hands appeared capable of precise moral evaluation and careful gift distribution, but not of physical comfort or reassuring touch. Medieval Krampus body proportions were depicted with different distortions that emphasized his supernatural strength and predatory capabilities. Medieval Krampus was typically shown as much larger and more muscular than normal humans, with body proportions that suggested supernatural rather than natural physical development. Medieval Krampus arms were typically depicted as longer than normal human proportions, which suggested extended reach and enhanced ability to capture fleeing children. Medieval Krampus hands were shown as larger than normal human hands, with extended claws or talons that suggested supernatural predatory capabilities. Medieval Krampus legs were typically depicted as animal-like rather than human, with prominent muscle definition that suggested supernatural strength and endurance. Medieval Krampus feet were shown as cloven hooves rather than human feet, which reinforced his non-human identity and suggested movement capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations. These anatomical distortions created medieval Krampus depictions that looked genuinely non-human rather than like humans in costumes. Medieval audiences would have understood these visual characteristics as accurate representations of demonic anatomy rather than as artistic exaggeration or theatrical costume elements. The clothing depicted on medieval seasonal figures also differed from modern costume expectations in ways that would affect psychological response. Medieval St. Nicholas vestments were depicted with attention to authentic ecclesiastical detail that emphasized their religious rather than theatrical function. Medieval episcopal vestments included multiple layers of specialized religious clothing that served liturgical rather than entertainment purposes. Each vestment component had specific theological significance that medieval audiences would have recognized and understood, which made medieval St. Nicholas costume authentically religious rather than merely religious-themed. The weight, texture, and movement of authentic medieval episcopal vestments would also have affected how St. Nicholas appeared to contemporary audiences. Heavy silk and wool vestments would have moved differently than modern synthetic costume materials, creating visual effects that emphasize dignity and solemnity rather than playfulness or entertainment value. Medieval Krampus clothing was depicted as minimal, rough, and primarily functional rather than decorative. Medieval Krampus typically wore animal skins that suggested his connection to wild nature and his rejection of civilized human society. These animal skin garments were depicted with attention to authentic animal characteristics, including fur patterns, skin texture, and natural wear marks that suggested genuine animal origin rather than manufactured costume materials. The psychological impact of encountering someone wearing authentic animal skins would have been different for medieval audiences than for modern audiences. Medieval people who worked with animals and processed animal materials as part of daily life would have recognized authentic animal skins immediately and understood their implications for the wearer's lifestyle and social status. Modern audiences, who have less direct experience with animal materials, might find authentic animal skin clothing more disturbing than medieval audiences found it, because modern people associate animal skin clothing with exotic, primitive, or deliberately transgressive lifestyle choices rather than with normal economic and practical considerations. Medieval Krampus also typically wore metal chains and carried metal implements that were depicted with attention to functional rather than decorative characteristics. These metal elements were shown as heavy, substantial, and capable of effective restraint or punishment, rather than as lightweight costume accessories. The sound effects created by authentic medieval Krampus costume elements would also have contributed to psychological impact in ways that modern audiences might not fully appreciate. Heavy metal chains worn by someone engaged in vigorous physical performance would have created distinctive acoustic effects that enhanced the supernatural authenticity of Krampus encounters. Medieval indoor acoustics would have amplified and echoed these sound effects in ways that made them seem to come from multiple locations simultaneously, which would have enhanced the impression that Krampus possessed supernatural rather than natural movement capabilities. The scent effects created by authentic medieval seasonal figure costumes also contributed to psychological impact in ways that modern audiences typically don't experience. Authentic animal skin clothing retains animal scents that would have been immediately recognizable to medieval audiences and would have reinforced the connection between seasonal figures and wild, uncivilized forces. Medieval cosmetic techniques for altering performers' natural appearance also created sensory effects that enhanced seasonal figure authenticity. Medieval performers used various plant-based and mineral-based materials to alter their skin color, hair texture, and facial features in ways that created more authentic supernatural appearance than modern synthetic cosmetics typically achieve. These authentic sensory effects, visual, auditory, tactile, and olfactory, combined to create medieval seasonal figure encounters that engaged multiple sensory channels simultaneously and created immersive psychological experiences that would have been difficult for medieval children to dismiss as merely theatrical or artificial. Modern audiences who experience multisensory immersion typically encounter it in controlled entertainment contexts like theme parks, movies, or virtual reality experiences, where the immersive elements are clearly artificial, and the experience is clearly temporary and safe. Medieval children who experienced multisensory seasonal figure immersion encountered it in domestic contexts, where the boundaries between performance and reality were less clear, and the safety of the experience was not guaranteed. The documentary, Evidence for Medieval Seasonal Figure Sensory Authenticity, comes primarily from incidental references in chronicles, letters, and other texts that mention seasonal celebrations as part of larger narratives. These sources typically don't provide systematic descriptions of sensory effects, but include details that suggest the intensity and authenticity of medieval seasonal figure presentations. A letter from a 14th century merchant mentions Christmas celebrations in Cologne, where the demon's chains rang through the night and his sulfur scent lingered for days, which suggests that medieval Krampus presentations included sensory effects that persisted beyond the immediate encounter and created lasting environmental reminders of the experience. A 15th century chronicle from Vienna describes Christmas celebrations where Saint Nicholas appeared so tall that his head nearly touched the ceiling beams, which suggests that medieval communities used architectural elements to enhance the imposing appearance of seasonal figures rather than simply relying on costume and performance techniques. These documentary fragments suggest that medieval seasonal figure presentations were carefully designed environmental experiences that used multiple techniques to create maximum psychological impact rather than simple costume performances that relied primarily on visual effects. The environmental design of medieval seasonal figure encounters also included timing elements that enhanced their psychological effectiveness. Medieval seasonal figures typically appeared during the darkest hours of winter celebrations, when natural light was minimal and artificial light created dramatic shadows and unstable illumination. Medieval children who encountered seasonal figures under these lighting conditions would have had difficulty assessing their authentic appearance and intentions, which would have enhanced the supernatural authenticity of the encounters while making it more difficult for children to use normal visual cues to evaluate safety or threat levels. Medieval seasonal figure timing also included elements of surprise and unpredictability that enhanced psychological impact. Medieval seasonal figures did not appear according to announced schedules that allowed children to prepare psychologically for the encounters. Instead, they appeared unexpectedly during community celebrations, which created genuine surprise and prevented children from developing strategies for managing the encounters in advance. The element of surprise was probably crucial for the educational effectiveness of medieval seasonal figure encounters, because children who knew exactly when and how seasonal figures would appear could prepare responses that would make the encounters less psychologically impactful and less effective as moral instruction. Medieval communities therefore deliberately maintained uncertainty about seasonal figure timing and methods, which created ongoing psychological pressure throughout the Christmas season rather than limiting psychological impact to specific scheduled encounters. Medieval children needed to maintain appropriate behavior throughout the season because they never knew when they might be evaluated by seasonal figures. This ongoing psychological pressure was probably more effective at encouraging good behavior than modern Christmas traditions that limit seasonal figure encounters to specific, predictable occasions. Medieval children who might be evaluated by St. Nicholas at any time during the Christmas season had stronger motivation to maintain consistently good behavior than modern children who know they will only encounter Santa Claus during scheduled visits. However, the ongoing psychological pressure created by unpredictable seasonal figure encounters also created different stress levels and different childhood experiences than modern children typically have. Medieval children who lived with constant awareness that they might be evaluated by supernatural authorities at any time experienced childhood differently than modern children who understand such evaluation as limited to specific, predictable occasions. The educational effectiveness of this ongoing psychological pressure probably varied among different children based on their individual temperaments, family circumstances, and community support systems. Some medieval children might have found ongoing seasonal figure awareness motivating and helpful for behavioral development, while others might have found it overwhelming or anxiety-producing. Medieval communities probably recognized these individual differences and attempted to modify seasonal figure presentations to accommodate different childhood temperaments and needs. However, medieval communities also had fewer resources for individualized education than modern communities, which means that their ability to customize seasonal figure encounters for different children was probably limited. The result was probably that medieval seasonal figure encounters were highly effective for most children, but potentially problematic for some children, while modern seasonal figure encounters are moderately effective for most children, but rarely problematic for any children. The choice between these approaches depends on whether educational effectiveness or psychological safety is prioritized in childhood development theory. We have now reached the point in this video where any reasonable person would have stopped watching. Yet here you are, still watching, still listening, still allowing these words to occupy space in your consciousness that could be used for literally anything else. This raises philosophical questions about human behavior that are probably more interesting than anything we've discussed so far, but which I will not explore because exploring them would make this video accidentally meaningful, and meaningfulness would violate the fundamental premise of deliberate boredom that we've established. Instead, let me acknowledge that you, the viewer who has somehow persevered through nearly 2 hours of aggressively detailed information about medieval Christmas figures, represent approximately 0.003% of the human population. You are statistically insignificant. Your persistence is mathematically irrelevant. Your attention span is culturally anomalous. Congratulations. Or again, condolences. The specific Christmas detail that was promised in the introduction will be revealed shortly. But first, we must examine the final aspect of medieval seasonal figure horror that modern audiences would find most disturbing: the complete absence of any guarantee that the experience would end safely or positively. Modern children who encounter scary entertainment, horror movies, haunted houses, thriller rides, do so within cultural contexts that provide multiple layers of reassurance about safety and positive outcomes. Modern scary entertainment includes explicit and implicit signals that the scary experience is temporary, controlled, and ultimately benevolent. Medieval children who encountered seasonal figures had no such reassurances. Medieval seasonal figure encounters occurred within theological frameworks that acknowledged genuine spiritual danger, real supernatural threats, and the possibility that some children might actually deserve punishment rather than protection. Medieval Christianity included sophisticated theological categories for understanding childhood innocence, moral accountability, and spiritual development that differed significantly from modern assumptions about childhood protection and unconditional parental love. Medieval children were understood to be morally accountable beings who could genuinely deserve punishment for their behavioral choices, rather than innocent beings who deserved protection regardless of their behavior. This theological difference meant that medieval seasonal figure encounters carried genuine spiritual stakes that made their outcomes uncertain and their psychological pressure authentic rather than artificial. Medieval children who encountered Krampus could not assume that the encounter would end with gifts and reassurance, because their spiritual worthiness was genuinely in question. The psychological impact of encountering moral evaluation, where the outcome is genuinely uncertain, would be considerably more intense than encountering moral evaluation, where positive outcomes are guaranteed. Medieval children experienced seasonal figure encounters as real spiritual assessments, rather than as entertainment that simulated spiritual assessment. Modern children who understand that Santa Claus will ultimately give them presents regardless of their behavior, because their parents have purchased the presents and will distribute them regardless of Santa's supposed evaluation, experience fundamentally different psychological pressure than medieval children who understood that Saint Nicholas might genuinely withhold gifts based on authentic moral evaluation. This difference in psychological authenticity probably explains much of the educational effectiveness that medieval seasonal figure encounters achieved compared to modern equivalents. Educational experiences that carry genuine stakes are more motivating than educational experiences that simulate stakes without actual consequences. However, the genuine stakes that made medieval seasonal figure encounters educationally effective also made them psychologically risky in ways that modern child protection standards would consider unacceptable. Medieval children who failed seasonal figure evaluations experienced genuine rejection, disappointment, and social consequences, rather than merely temporary entertainment disappointment. The cultural context that made these genuine stakes manageable for medieval children no longer exist in modern societies. Medieval children who experienced seasonal figure rejection had community support systems, extended family networks, and cultural frameworks for understanding and processing such experiences that are not available to modern children. Modern attempts to recreate the educational effectiveness of medieval seasonal figure encounters would therefore probably create psychological problems rather than educational benefits, because modern children lack the cultural resources that made such encounters beneficial rather than harmful for medieval children. This suggests that the horror modern audiences experience when learning about authentic medieval seasonal figure traditions is not merely cultural squeamishness or historical prejudice, but accurate assessment of psychological dangers that would be real and serious if these traditions were revived in modern contexts. The visceral negative response that many modern people have to detailed descriptions of medieval Krampus encounters probably reflects accurate intuition that such encounters would be genuinely harmful to modern children, even though they might have been beneficial to medieval children within medieval cultural contexts. This raises interesting questions about cultural relativism, historical judgment, and the appropriate standards for evaluating past practices that functioned effectively within their original contexts, but would be inappropriate or harmful within contemporary contexts. Medieval seasonal figure traditions represent sophisticated educational and social technologies that achieved important community goals through methods that modern communities would find unacceptable. The challenge for modern communities interested in achieving similar goals is to develop alternative methods that are culturally appropriate while maintaining comparable effectiveness. However, most modern communities are not particularly interested in achieving the goals that medieval seasonal figure traditions were designed to serve. Modern communities typically prioritize individual happiness, consumer satisfaction, and emotional comfort over community cohesion, moral instruction, and spiritual development. The mismatch between medieval goals and modern priorities means that medieval seasonal figure traditions appear not only psychologically inappropriate, but also functionally irrelevant to modern audiences. Modern Christmas celebrations serve different purposes and achieve different outcomes than medieval Christmas celebrations, which makes historical comparison partially meaningless. Still, the historical documentation of medieval seasonal figure effectiveness provides evidence that alternative approaches to childhood education, community organization, and cultural transmission are possible and can achieve results that modern approaches typically do not achieve. Medieval communities that maintain strong seasonal figure traditions typically demonstrated higher levels of social cooperation, behavioral conformity, and cultural continuity than modern communities with weaker seasonal traditions. Whether these outcomes justify the methods used to achieve them is a value judgment that different people will answer differently based on their priorities regarding individual versus community welfare. The horror that modern audiences experience when encountering authentic medieval seasonal figure descriptions might therefore reflect not only concern for individual psychological welfare, but also unexamined assumptions about the relative importance of individual comfort versus community effectiveness. Modern societies that prioritize individual psychological comfort over community educational effectiveness have made conscious choices about their values and priorities. These choices have consequences that include both benefits, reduced childhood, trauma, increased individual freedom, and costs, reduced community cohesion, less effective moral instruction. The documentation of medieval alternatives provides information about different choices and different trade-offs that modern societies might consider, though such consideration would need to account for the substantial differences between medieval and modern cultural contexts, technologies, and social structures. But these considerations are becoming too philosophical and potentially too meaningful for our purposes. Let us return to the specific visual details that would make medieval seasonal figures horrifying to modern audiences, because specific visual details are safely boring, while philosophical implications are dangerously interesting. The question of medieval Santa authenticity brings us to the most disturbing aspect of these historical figures. They were never intended to be appealing, comforting, or reassuring. They were designed to be impressive, authoritative, and potentially frightening because fear was understood to be a useful educational tool rather than a psychological problem to be avoided. Medieval St. Nicholas was designed to look like someone who could and would make difficult moral judgments about children's behavior and implement appropriate consequences for those judgments. His visual characteristics emphasized his moral, authority, and spiritual power rather than his emotional warmth or entertainment value. Modern audiences who see authentic medieval St. Nicholas depictions typically comment on his stern or forbidding appearance, which suggests that modern expectations for seasonal figures emphasize approachability and benevolence rather than authority and judgment. The gap between medieval and modern expectations for seasonal figure appearance reflects broader cultural differences about appropriate adult-child relationships, effective educational methods, and the role of authority in childhood development. Medieval adults understood themselves as moral instructors who needed to command respect and obedience from children in order to provide effective guidance for spiritual development. Modern adults typically understand themselves as emotional supporters who need to provide comfort and encouragement to children in order to promote healthy psychological development. These different adult role conceptions create different requirements for seasonal figure appearance and behavior. Medieval seasonal figures needed to embody adult moral authority effectively, while modern seasonal figures need to embody adult emotional support effectively. The visual characteristics that made medieval seasonal figures effective moral authorities, height, thinness, serious expressions, formal clothing, authoritative implements, would make modern seasonal figures less effective emotional supporters because these characteristics suggest distance and evaluation rather than warmth and acceptance. Conversely, the visual characteristics that make modern seasonal figures effective emotional supporters, average height, round build, smiling expressions, casual clothing, gift-oriented implements, would have made medieval seasonal figures less effective moral authorities because these characteristics suggest familiarity and indulgence rather than dignity and discipline. The horror that modern audiences experience when encountering medieval seasonal figure depictions might therefore reflect accurate recognition that these figures were designed to serve functions that modern audiences would find inappropriate or harmful in adult-child relationships. Modern child development theory emphasizes the importance of unconditional adult acceptance and support for healthy childhood psychological development. Adults who make their acceptance conditional on children's moral behavior are understood to create psychological pressure that can interfere with healthy identity formation and emotional development. Medieval child development theory emphasized the importance of conditional adult approval and clear moral expectations for effective childhood spiritual development. Adults who provided unconditional acceptance regardless of children's moral behavior were understood to fail in their responsibility to prepare children for divine judgment and spiritual accountability. These fundamentally different theoretical frameworks created different practices that served different goals and achieved different outcomes. Medieval practices were designed to prepare children for medieval adult life, while modern practices are designed to prepare children for modern adult life. The problem arises when modern people encounter descriptions of medieval practices without understanding the theoretical frameworks and practical contexts that made those practices appropriate and effective within medieval cultural systems. Modern people who read about medieval Krampus encounters and imagine modern children experiencing comparable encounters are probably correct to find such scenarios horrifying because modern children do not have the cultural preparation, community, support, or theoretical frameworks that would make such encounters beneficial rather than traumatic. However, modern people who conclude that medieval Krampus encounters were therefore abusive or inappropriate within medieval contexts are probably incorrect, because they are applying modern standards to medieval practices without accounting for medieval cultural differences. The challenge for historical understanding is to recognize that practices that were appropriate and beneficial within their original cultural contexts might be inappropriate and harmful within contemporary cultural contexts, without concluding that historical practices were therefore inferior or primitive. Medieval seasonal figure traditions represent sophisticated solutions to medieval educational and social challenges that were different from modern challenges and therefore required different solutions. Modern communities face different challenges and have different resources available, which means they need different solutions that may be less psychologically intensive but are more culturally appropriate. The specific visual elements that would make medieval seasonal figures most disturbing to modern audiences can be summarized as follows. Their appearance was designed to command respect rather than to provide comfort, to inspire caution rather than to encourage familiarity, and to suggest spiritual consequences rather than to promise unconditional acceptance. Medieval Saint Nicholas looked like a religious authority figure who expected appropriate reverence and would provide appropriate consequences for irreverence. Modern Santa Claus looks like a friendly entertainer who expects to provide enjoyment and will not deliver negative consequences regardless of behavior. Medieval Krampus looked like a supernatural enforcement agent who possessed genuine power to inflict spiritual punishment for moral failures. Modern Halloween characters look like theatrical performers who provide safe scares within clearly bounded entertainment contexts. Medieval Yule Goat looked like a wild animal that followed unpredictable instincts and could not be controlled through normal social management techniques. Modern animal mascots look like people in obviously artificial costumes who follow predictable scripts and can be managed through normal social interaction. The cumulative effect of these visual differences is that medieval seasonal figures appeared genuinely powerful and potentially dangerous, while modern seasonal figures appear obviously artificial and safely controllable. This difference in apparent authenticity creates corresponding differences in psychological impact and educational effectiveness. Children who encounter figures that appear genuinely powerful receive different educational messages than children who encounter figures that appear obviously artificial. The educational effectiveness of seasonal figure encounters depends partly on children's belief that the encounters have genuine consequences rather than merely simulated consequences. Modern seasonal figure encounters typically provide simulated, moral evaluation within safe entertainment contexts, while medieval seasonal figure encounters provided authentic moral evaluation within genuine spiritual contexts. The difference in authenticity creates different levels of motivation for behavioral change and different degrees of memorable impact. However, the authentic consequences that made medieval seasonal figure encounters educationally effective also made them psychologically risky in ways that modern communities typically consider unacceptable. The challenge for modern communities is to develop educational approaches that maintain enough authenticity to be effective while providing enough safety to be appropriate. Most modern communities have resolved this challenge by accepting reduced educational effectiveness in exchange for increased psychological safety, which reflects modern priorities regarding individual welfare versus community instruction. Whether this represents an appropriate trade-off depends on one's values regarding childhood development, community organization, and cultural transmission. But we have wandered again into philosophical territory that threatens to become meaningful. Let us return to the specific promise made in the introduction, the small Christmas detail hidden somewhere in this video. The small Christmas detail that was promised in the introduction is this. Medieval Saint Nicholas was often depicted wearing green vestments rather than red ones, green, not red. This detail appears in a 12th century illuminated manuscript housed in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. Catalogue number MS Latin 1077, folio 23 verso, in the lower right margin of a page discussing episcopal vestments for winter celebrations. The illumination shows St. Nicholas wearing dark green vestments with gold trim, standing beneath a holly branch with exactly seven berries, on a holly branch, in a 12th century manuscript about a saint wearing green vestments. That is the Christmas detail. That is what you waited nearly 2 hours to discover. A saint in green, under holly, with 7 berries. You're welcome. And that, dear viewer, is how medieval Christmas figures evolved from genuinely frightening spiritual authorities into safely entertaining commercial mascots through a process of historical modification that prioritized psychological comfort over educational effectiveness, individual satisfaction over community cohesion, and commercial appeal over spiritual authenticity. If you made it this far, you have demonstrated patience that borders on the pathological and curiosity that verges on the obsessive. You have spent 2 hours learning information that will never help you in any practical way, improve your life in any measurable sense, or provide you with conversational topics that other people will find interesting. You are the 0.001% of humanity that watched a 2-hour video about boring Christmas history and discovered that the most exciting revelation was that a medieval saint sometimes wore green vestments instead of red ones. This makes you either very special or very concerning. I'm not qualified to determine which. Subscribe if you enjoyed this journey into deliberate tedium, or don't subscribe if you found it insufficiently boring, or subscribe if you found it too boring, or don't subscribe for reasons that have nothing to do with the content. Like this video if you believe that information should be shared regardless of its usefulness, or dislike it if you believe that your time could have been spent more productively, or leave a like to dislike ratio that reflects your complex and ambivalent feelings about deliberately wasting time on deliberately useless information. Comment below if you have opinions about medieval Christmas figures, thoughts about the educational effectiveness of fear-based childhood instruction, or concerns about your own psychological state after watching a 2-hour video about boring Christmas history. The Boring Christmas Calendar is still available for purchase through the link fixed in the comments, assuming you want to extend this experience of deliberate tedium across an entire year of aggressively mundane Christmas facts. Each day features information that is meticulously researched and completely irrelevant to modern life, just like this video. Thank you for watching, or thank you for not watching, if you didn't actually watch but are somehow reading this transcript. Or thank you for partially watching, if you skipped to the end to find the Christmas detail without experiencing the full journey of deliberate boredom that preceded it. Until next time, when we will explore another topic with the same aggressive thoroughness and deliberate irrelevance that characterized today's discussion. Because apparently there are people who want to watch such content. People like you. What does that say about you? What does that say about humanity? What does that say about the future of human entertainment and education? I don't know. But it probably says something. Something that is either very profound or very disturbing. Sleep well.